your lovely daughter doing? What was her name again? Marley, was it? Morin, Ethne corrected him immediately, her voice taking on an icy, dangerous edge. It had recently, and most disturbingly, come to her attention that her beloved daughter, Morin, had developed something of an affection, a girlish crush, for this infuriating, unpredictable D'Hoin. Such a thing bothered her greatly, and the absolute last thing she wanted was for him to take any sort of mutual, or even passing, interest in her child. Morin, right? Of course, Harry said, seemingly oblivious to her frosty tone. My apologies. How's she doing then? She is fine, Ethne said, her voice clipped, clearly trying to shut down this particular topic of conversation as quickly as possible. Harry looked up at her, and thankfully, seemed to take the rather unsubtle hint. All right then, he said, a knowing glint in his eye. Well, it seems we're just about out of this delicious tea, so I guess I can probably leave a little earlier today than I usually do. He stood up, stretching languidly. Ethne let out a small, almost inaudible sigh of relief at the man seemingly, finally, preparing to leave. She truly didn't know what she had done in her long life for the ancient spirits of the forest to have cursed her with his recurring, disruptive presence. Good, she told him, her voice firm. Please, do not return. She knew, with a certainty that made her heart sink, that he would not listen to her plea, but she only had fading hope left at this point. Harry just smiled at her, that same infuriating, enigmatic smile. See you in a few years, my lady, he told her, and then, with a soft pop, he was gone. Ethne just frowned in deep annoyance, then, with another sigh, turned her thoughts back to the more pressing, and considerably less confusing, problem of how to deal with the recent, increasingly bold attacks from the humans of Verdun. Year 1216. Harry's POV. Harry, in his massive, coal-black dragon form, watched with a distinct lack of interest as these supposed witchers danced and darted around his colossal form. They were clearly making some kind of clumsy, coordinated effort to distract him while one or the other tried to find an opening, a vulnerability, to take him out. Harry, on the other hand, just continued to sit there, his enormous head resting on his forelegs, watching them with a single, uninterested, half-lidded emerald eye. These particular witchers, he noted with a flicker of disdain, were most obviously not from the noble school of the wolf, like Gerald. No, these ones, with their flashy, overly acrobatic movements and their slightly shifty eyes, were almost certainly from the much maligned school of the cat, if his observations were to be believed. They were also, he had quickly concluded, very, very stupid. The fact that they had willingly taken a contract out on him, a dragon of his unprecedented size and power, and then had the sheer audacity to wake him up in the middle of his much-needed winter hibernation, said quite a lot about their distinct lack of intelligence and common sense. Harry had already, quite calmly, decided that he was going to cook them both alive, nice and slow, and then perhaps deposit their charred, crispy remains somewhere highly public, just as a clear, unambiguous message to make sure no one else tried this kind of foolishness again anytime soon. Vicar! Go around him! Get to his flank, one of them yelled at his partner, his voice tight with exertion. I'll keep him distracted from the front. All right, Eskel. Just don't get yourself cooked, the one now identified as Vicar responded back, his own voice strained. He seems pretty docile right now, but that could change at any bloody moment. Harry pretended to focus his attention on the man Eskel, apparently who was currently jumping around erratically in front of him, waving his sword about like a particularly clumsy and idiotic dancer, all while the other one, Vicar, attempted to creep up silently behind him. A classic, and rather predictable, pincer maneuver. He didn't even need to turn his massive head or use his magically enhanced senses to know exactly where Vicar was. With a sudden, almost leisurely flick of his huge, spiked tail, he swung it quickly and smashed it into the unfortunate witcher who was trying to sneak up on his blind side. Even with their famously enhanced senses and reflexes, his tail was simply too big, too fast, and covered too much ground for the man to realistically dodge. Vicar was quickly, and rather messily, killed as he was slammed with the full, bone-shattering force of Harry's tail up against the hard, unyielding stone wall of the cave. There was a sickening, wet crunch, and then silence. Vicar, the remaining witcher, Eskel, yelled, his voice filled with anguish and rage as he looked at the crumpled, lifeless form of his now dead companion. He then turned back to Harry, his eyes blazing with a furious, vengeful glare. Chapter 23, Chapter 23, Ashes. If you want to read ahead by 10 chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Vicar, the remaining witcher, Eskel, yelled, his voice filled with anguish and rage as he looked at the crumpled, lifeless form of his now dead companion. He then turned back to Harry, his eyes blazing with a furious, vengeful glare. "You'll pay for that, you bloody beast," the man yelled, his voice cracking with emotion, as he charged recklessly towards Harry, his sword held high. Harry swiped at him with one of his enormous, razor-sharp claws, and to the man's credit, he actually managed to dodge the attack, ducking under the sweeping blow with surprising agility. The man quickly, almost desperately, cast a shimmering Quen sign on himself, the magical shield flaring to life around him in the hopes that it would give him at least some small measure of protection against the enraged dragon. Harry had to admit, grudgingly, that it was probably the smartest, and indeed only, magical move the Witcher could make in this situation. Most of the Witcher's limited, sign-based magic wouldn't be nearly powerful enough to actually affect him in any significant way. Even the Quen shield probably wouldn't do much against a direct hit from him, but it was, he supposed, better than absolutely nothing. "All right then, Kmen, you overgrown lizard," the Witcher yelled defiantly, trying to sound braver than he undoubtedly felt, as he readied his silver sword, its polished blade gleaming faintly in the dim cave light. Harry had learned, quite recently after first arriving in this world, that silver swords, while certainly effective against many monsters, could do little more than leave superficial scratches on his incredibly tough, magically reinforced dragon hide. He had also discovered, much to his surprise, that other, native dragons in this world seemed to be significantly weaker than he was, both physically and magically, though they did possess the rather unique ability to absorb most forms of offensive magic, which wasn't something Harry himself could do while in his dragon form. An interesting evolutionary divergence. Harry finally, with a sound like grinding boulders, pushed himself up to his full, truly massive height, towering over the puny, solitary Witcher. He stared down at the brave, foolish man, his emerald eyes glowing with an inner fire. He swiped his claws once more, a feint this time, and just as he expected, the man skillfully, reflexively, dodged out of the way. Harry, however, had anticipated this exact move. As the Witcher moved, Harry opened his massive jaws and bellowed a torrent of white-hot, incandescent flames directly at the now exposed man. He heard a brief, terrified scream, quickly cut short, before the intense, magical flames completely engulfed and incinerated the Witcher. Harry grunted in annoyance once the man was well and truly dead, the smell of cooked meat now filling the cave. It seemed like every few years, some remote village or another would get brave or desperate and put a contract out on him, the great black dragon of the peaks. It was mainly so-called dragon professionals, usually just overconfident hunters or charlatans who came after him, but occasionally, like today, he would get an overzealous Witcher, or in this case, two of them, who got in way over their heads and decided to try and kill him for a pouch of coin. Idiots! Harry shifted his massive body, the scales rippling and flowing, back into his familiar human form. He stood over the charred, smoking remains of the unfortunate Witcher, his face scrunched up in distaste at the acrid, burnt smell coming from the body. Quickly, he pulled out his wand and, with a muttered incantation, vanished the remains of the witcher completely. No need to leave a mess. With that done, he walked over to the other one, Vicar, the one he'd smashed against the wall. He crouched down and checked the body over. It was actually relatively intact, considering how incredibly hard he had slammed it against the unyielding stone. He wondered, with a flicker of scientific curiosity, if witchers possessed a naturally stronger, more resilient bone structure than the average human. That brought him to thinking about the other various non-human races he had encountered in this world, and their unique physical structures and biological adaptations. Obviously, vampires, the higher ones at least, had much stronger muscles and a significantly denser bone structure than humans. This meant that their metabolism was also much higher than most other creatures, which was precisely why they had to drink blood tea carried a far greater concentration of energy than most other foods did, even when those foods were eaten raw. Harry knew that witchers underwent significant, often dangerous, mutations as part of their creation, thanks to Ciri mentioning it briefly when talking about her surrogate father, Gerald, all those years ago. But he didn't truly know the full extent of those mutations, or how they affected their physiology beyond the obvious enhanced senses and reflexes. It was something he'd have to research further, when he had the time. Always more to learn, always more to discover. Harry gave the crumpled body of the witcher a cursory kick with his foot, just to make absolutely, positively sure the man was fully and completely dead. Satisfied that there was no lingering twitch or groan, he then, with a grunt of effort, picked up the surprisingly heavy corpse and began to drag it towards his hidden little laboratory, a section of the cave he'd expanded and kitted out over the years. He cleared off the large, sturdy stone table that usually held all his little notes, his complex calculations, and his meticulously drawn-out plans he had for when Ciri finally decided to grace this world with her actual presence and, pop out of her unsuspecting mother for the very first time. He then carefully, almost reverently, slumped the witcher's lifeless body onto the now cleared table and got started on his impromptu examination. If you want to read ahead by 10 chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 24, Signs. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. First, he used his considerable healing magic to mend all the physical wounds on the witcher's body. Before he'd left Britain, all those decades ago, Harry had been widely, and correctly, considered a true magical genius, a prodigy, because of his multiple, officially recognized masteries in the highly complex subjects of potions, defense against the dark arts, ancient runes, herbology, and, perhaps most impressively, healing magic. Most of those masteries he had acquired simply because he was either incredibly bored at the time, or because they directly helped with his ongoing, often esoteric, research projects. Healing, surprisingly, was the only one of those demanding disciplines that he had actually pursued simply from a genuine, burning desire to know more on the subject, to understand the intricate workings of life and recovery. Unsurprisingly, his initial motivation for delving so deeply into healing magic had stemmed from a vivid, haunting memory. He had remembered, with painful clarity, how incredibly lucky he had been all those years ago when Ciri had been so grievously injured by the wild hunt. He'd managed to cobble together a desperate, last-minute solution that, by some miracle, had just happened to work. He had vowed then and there that he wanted to make absolutely sure that he would be able to truly help, effectively and without relying on sheer luck, any time one of his friends, or anyone he cared about, needed it in the future. It was precisely that same drive, that same fierce protectiveness, that had led him to create the dragonpox vaccine. Little Rose Weasley, his goddaughter, his niece in all but blood, had contracted the dreadful, usually fatal, magical disease. He had worked, almost non-stop, for nearly an entire, agonizing year straight to find a solution, to create a cure for that terrible little issue, and he had thankfully made it just in the nick of time, when the poor, brave little girl had been on her very deathbed. Harry shook his head, trying to clear away the distracting, bittersweet reminiscing, as he focused his attention back on the now physically healed, but still very much dead, body of the Witcher he had just killed. Now, obviously, he couldn't bring the man back to actual life. That was far beyond even his considerable magical abilities, and frankly, he didn't particularly want to, in this case. But he could temporarily imitate some of the physical processes of life within the body. He'd come up with a clever, rather complex little spell some years ago that could restart the heart, keep it pumping blood throughout the circulatory system, but only for as long as he actively held and maintained the spell. So, physically, on a purely biological level, the man would appear to be alive, his systems functioning. But since he had not had any oxygen circulating to his brain for far too long now, he would still be, for all intents and purposes, brain dead. Still, even with that limitation, Harry could at least conduct some useful tests on the Witcher's unique physiology now. Harry started by seeing how the Witcher's body handled different, common strains of bacteria and viruses being introduced directly into its system. The results, he had to admit, had been a little disappointing, to be honest. The Witcher's body did handle the various pathogens better than an average human body would, but not by a significant margin, not by as much as he had expected. In fact, he had been genuinely surprised that it handled them so relatively poorly. He had seen the clear evidence of the powerful mutagens that had been integrated into the man's bloodstream, into almost every cell and tissue of his body. Logically, those mutagens should have been giving the body a much stronger, much more robust immunity system than it currently possessed. Harry wasn't sure if the original mutagenic formula was somehow flawed, or if he was perhaps missing some crucial, unknown factor in his analysis. The next thing he looked into was the muscle and tissue structure of a Witcher. This was clearly where the various mutagens shone through the most, where their effects were most pronounced. Muscle density had definitely been significantly increased, and the muscle fibers themselves seemed to retain their integrity and strength much better, even post-mortem, than he had observed in human tissues in the past. This easily explained their documented, almost superhuman, increases in speed, agility, and raw physical strength. He wished, for a fleeting moment, that he could somehow magically reanimate the man, just temporarily, to run him through a series of rigorous physical tests, to quantify his limits. But sadly, that wasn't really in the cards, not with his current magical repertoire. Despite these obvious enhancements, though, he still got the distinct, nagging feeling that it all could have been better. More efficient. More potent. He probably couldn't give them the kind of insane, off-the-charts strength and speed that a higher vampire possessed, or anything even close to it, but there was definitely, he felt, considerable room for improvement in the Witcher mutagenic process. The last interesting, and rather unfortunate, thing he had found during his examination was that the mutagenic cocktail, as a side effect, actually rendered the user completely sterile. That must have been quite bothersome, even heartbreaking, if any of them ever wanted to have children of their own. Although, he recalled Ciri mentioning that it apparently hadn't stopped good old Geralt of Rivia from raising her as his own beloved daughter, his child of surprise. Still, from a purely biological standpoint, that was quite an unfortunate, and rather limiting, side effect. Last, but certainly not least, was the limited, almost rudimentary, magic that Witchers were known to use their signs. This, in Harry's expert opinion, was actually one of the most impressive, almost miraculous, things that the mutagens seemed to achieve, mainly because, based on his extensive knowledge of magical theory and biology, it should have been completely impossible. He hadn't encountered a single magical plant, a single alchemical ingredient, a single naturally occurring magical phenomenon on this entire world that made him believe in even the remotest possibility of artificially grafting a functional magic reserve onto a non-magical human being. It was, frankly, astonishing that every single witcher who underwent the trial of the grasses didn't just implode in on themselves from the sheer, overwhelming magical and biological stresses. If someone had asked Harry, before he'd seen it with his own eyes, if there was even a slight chance of anyone surviving the incredibly traumatic process of what these mutagens apparently did to the human body, he would have laughed dismissively in their face and called them completely insane. It was an absolute, unadulterated miracle, in his honest, professional opinion, that any of them survived at all. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 25, Chapter 25, Black Mage. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. It was an absolute, unadulterated miracle, in his honest, professional opinion, that any of them survived at all. Still, despite the miraculous nature of their induced magic, witchers did have definite limitations. Their magical pool was very, very small, especially when compared to the sorcerers and sorceresses of this world, who seemed to possess, on average, much larger, much more potent magical reserves than even the most powerful wizards and witches from his own original world. This was probably due, Harry theorized, to the fact that the magic users here didn't generally rely on magical focuses like wands or staves, instead channeling raw magic directly. A witcher, by comparison, had just enough innate magic to perform some of the weaker, more basic spells. In fact, he was almost certain that the 5 main signs they were known to use Ard, Igni, Yrden, Quen, and Axii had been specifically, and very cleverly, modified and simplified over time so that they could be used more easily, more efficiently, with such a limited magical capacity. At the end of all his detailed observations and meticulous tests, Harry finally, and rather reluctantly, concluded that it was most likely that whoever had originally concocted the complex, dangerous formula to give witchers their unique mutagens, they had probably made it largely by either sheer, dumb luck, or perhaps even completely by accident. If the limited calculations he could make, based on the biological evidence before him, were even remotely correct, then it was primarily a matter of incredible luck, as well as the precise order and exact timing of the administering of the various volatile ingredients, that really made the crucial difference between a successful transformation and a gruesome, agonizing death. He was pretty sure, based on his analysis, that the various mutagens all conflicted violently with each other within the subject's body, but in just a certain, very specific, almost paradoxical way, that it would occasionally, very occasionally, allow a strong enough, resilient enough individual to somehow live through the horrific ordeal of the trial. Then, once the initial transformation was complete, the mutagens would continue to both work against and with each other within the Witcher's system, simultaneously strengthening the user in some aspects while also, paradoxically, weakening or counteracting the effects of the other mutagens in their body as much as they possibly could. It was a delicate, precarious, and utterly insane biological balancing act. The final product of this chaotic, brutal process, if it was somehow successful, was a witcher. A witcher, Harry now realized with a new level of understanding, being a poorly crafted, highly unstable, mutated human being who was, in reality, always living precariously on the very cusp of catastrophic biological failure, without even realizing it themselves. I can't believe someone actually made such a poorly crafted, inefficient, and downright dangerous formula. Harry thought to himself, shaking his head in a mixture of awe and disbelief. I mean, obviously, there have to be better, safer, more effective ways to magically and biologically enhance people. I think. Probably. I wonder if. No, I need to stay focused on the plan. Ciri. Finding Ciri again, that's the plan. He mentally chastised himself. But then, another, more insidious thought crept in. But I do still have quite a few years ahead of me, don't I? Before she's even born. And getting some more practical, hands-on experience with the unique anatomy and physiology of the different creatures and races of this world, well, that might actually end up helping me in the long run, right? It's all research. He sighed. Well, maybe just a few more years of dedicated study, I suppose. A little side project. Just to keep my skills sharp. And then, it's right back to planning for Ciri. Definitely. Year 1229. Harry's POV. Are you the one they call the Black Mage? A regal, yet undeniably beautiful woman asked him, her voice carrying an air of authority. Harry, who had been thoroughly engrossed in a rather fascinating treatise on interdimensional botany, looked up from his book with a confused, slightly annoyed raised eyebrow. He was currently trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace and quiet, reading in a public garden in the surprisingly picturesque city of Sintra. He was briefly, peripherally conscious of the fact that the entire street, all the passers-by and merchants, had suddenly gone silent and were now staring intently at the woman who had just addressed him. This meant she was either royalty of some significance, or at the very least, a very high-ranking, influential noble. The what now? Harry asked, his confusion genuine. Black Mage? That was a new one. The Black Mage, the woman repeated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the entire world. As in, the immortal Black Mage that randomly appears every few years, out of nowhere, and seems to cause both great miracles and terrible disasters wherever he goes. Harry just stared at her, a flicker of surprise finally registering on his face. He didn't remember acquiring a title, especially one as dramatic as that. Then again, he tended to stay away from most towns and cities as a general rule. There was usually at least one person, one idiot, in every populated area that would inevitably cause him to lose his carefully maintained cool, go completely berserk, and start redecorating the local landscape with extreme prejudice. It was just easier for everyone if he kept to himself. I don't think I have ever been called that in my entire life, Harry finally said, neither confirming nor denying the woman's rather bold question, mostly because he honestly didn't know the answer himself. Was it not you? The woman continued, her gaze unwavering, her voice calm but persistent, who first appeared in the town of Belhaven, many years ago, where you massacred a significant portion of the town guard because they were attempting to unjustly kill an elven girl. Harry looked at the woman fully now, his initial annoyance giving way to a cautious curiosity. He did, indeed, remember a rather unpleasant incident in Belhaven, a town he had subsequently made sure to avoid. He had, in fact, killed some particularly unpleasant guards because they had been about to publicly execute an innocent elven girl. It was hardly an actual portion of the town, more like a handful of overly aggressive guards who tried to stop me from intervening, Harry remarked, his tone dry. Everyone else just ran off, rather quickly. The woman nodded, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. I thought it was you, she said, her voice softening slightly. I wish to beg for your assistance, Black Mage, as I am in dire, desperate need of your unique services. She then, much to Harry's surprise, sat down gracefully on the bench next to him, her expression turning deeply serious. Harry had to physically hold in a sigh of exasperation. The very last thing he wanted to do, ever, was to get himself entangled with a noble, especially a queen. They either wanted to use his power for their own gain, or they wanted something from him that he was unwilling or unable to give. Neither of those scenarios was something he was remotely okay with. I'm actually rather busy at the moment, Harry said, deliberately brushing the woman off as he turned back to his book, hoping she'd take the hint. So, you'll probably have to schedule an appointment. My PA is notoriously difficult to get a hold of. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 26, Chapter 26, Nothing. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. I'm actually rather busy at the moment, Harry said, deliberately brushing the woman off as he turned back to his book, hoping she'd take the hint. So, you'll probably have to schedule an appointment. My PA is notoriously difficult to get a hold of. He could practically hear the two guards flanking her physically reaching for the hilts of their swords, their disapproval radiating off them in waves. He also noticed, out of the corner of his eye, the woman to his right subtly waving her hand, a silent command to calm her clearly pissed off guards. "Will you not at least listen to what I have to ask of you?" the woman asked, her voice gentle, yet filled with an undercurrent of desperation. "I have been searching for you, for any sign of you, for many months now. It seems destiny itself has brought you to my city, to this very garden, today. Would you please, I implore you, at least listen to what I have to ask?" It wasn't quite begging, not in the groveling sense, but it was remarkably close. That had gotten Harry's attention. Nobles, especially queens, tended not to beg for anything. They usually thought they were inherently deserving of everything, simply by virtue of their birth. To hear this woman, this queen, plead with him, spoke volumes about her desperation. Also, to hear that she had apparently been actively looking for him for months, that was a little concerning. How had she even known where to start? "Fine," Harry said, finally closing his book with a sigh. "I make absolutely no promises to help you in any way, shape, or form. But I will, at least, listen to what you have to say. On one condition, you explain to me how, exactly, you know who I am, or rather, who you think I am." The woman breathed a visible sigh of relief, a grateful smile illuminating her regal features. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Audiobook. I am the Queen of Sintra." She paused, then continued, her voice taking on a more somber tone. "I ask you to help me with my daughter, my only child. I believe she has been struck with a terrible, unknown curse, and she has fallen gravely ill. I have asked both the most skilled sorcerers in the northern kingdoms and the most learned doctors to see her, but none of them can find the source of her debilitating illness. I have many friends, many contacts, in the more magically inclined communities, and I have heard talk of you, whispers of your mysterious, almost miraculous, healing powers. I have been trying to track you down for months, following every rumor, every vague sighting, but I had recently, almost completely, given up hope, until I saw you sitting here, today, as I was passing by in my carriage." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I myself possess some minor, latent skill with magic, enough to sense the aura of power around certain individuals. And I was able to feel your immense power, even from a distance. I knew then that it must have been you, the legendary Black Mage. That, combined with your distinctive black clothing, it all pointed to you. I know, I feel, it must have been destiny for our paths to meet today, in this place. Will you please help me save my daughter?" the Queen both explained and asked him, her composure finally starting to crack, tears welling in her eyes. Harry just took it all in for a minute, processing the information. It would seem, much to his surprise and slight annoyance, that he had indeed gotten himself quite a reputation, a legend even, without ever being consciously aware of it. Sure, he hadn't exactly been subtle in his actions over the past few decades, saving elves, dealing with troublesome monsters, occasionally redistributing the wealth of corrupt nobles, but he had honestly thought, with how relatively devolved and slow their communication methods were compared to his own original world, that any reliable knowledge of his person, his abilities, would have been quickly lost in the mists of rumor, exaggeration, and general confusion. Apparently not. It had also, evidently, been noted by some that he was quite old, or at least, had been around for a very long time, despite still looking so remarkably young. That could definitely be a problem. A big problem. He would need to seriously tone down his visits to public places, become much more discreet. If Ciri, when she was eventually born, heard of him, of this immortal black mage, before they were supposed to meet naturally, well, he wasn't actually sure what would happen, but that was just asking for a temporal paradox, a messy, unpredictable complication he absolutely did not need. Harry said finally, breaking the silence. Your daughter, you say? And you believe she's truly been cursed? I do not know for certain, Audiobook said, her voice trembling slightly. I only know that neither magical nor regular medical treatments seem to have any effect on her whatsoever. She just gets weaker, day by day. Harry thought about it, though his decision was already made. Of course, he was going to help her. If this Audiobook was the current queen of Sintra, then that meant Ciri, his Ciri, was almost certainly a direct descendant of hers, and therefore, a descendant of this sick daughter. If her daughter died now, before having children of her own, then there was a very real, very terrible chance that Ciri would never be born. Of course, the girl could always recover without his interference, through some other means. But it was also possible, however slim, that something Harry had inadvertently done while here in this world, some ripple effect from his actions, could have somehow affected the future, could have caused this girl to fall sick in the first place. Either way, he'd much rather be safe than sorry. The risk was simply too great. Fine, Harry agreed, standing up from the bench and tucking the book he had been reading into one of the deep inner pockets of his black cloak, a cloak which, he now realized with a grimace, he was apparently going to have to change, as it seemed to have become his unintentional calling card. I will go and attempt to heal your daughter. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Audiobook exclaimed, tears of relief now openly streaming down her face. She stood up quickly, her regal composure momentarily forgotten. If you can accomplish her healing, Black Mage, I will be most eternally grateful, and I will be willing to grant you any reward that is within my power to give. There is nothing in your power, Your Majesty, Harry said to her, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as she began to lead him towards the distant, imposing silhouette of the Sintra castle, that you could possibly give me that I would truly want. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 27, Chapter 27, Royal Palace. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. There is nothing in your power that you could give me that I would want, Harry said to her, his tone polite but firm, as she began to lead him through the bustling city streets towards the imposing Sintra castle. Perhaps not, Queen Audiobook replied, a hint of a smile playing on her lips, not letting Harry's dismissive statement get to her in the slightest. But I shall offer anyways, Black Mage. You may one day change your mind. They approached the tall, formidable castle, its stone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, and walked through its main gates with no problem at all. It was, Harry mused, the first time he had ever been willingly invited into a royal palace and not had to sneak in secretly, under the cover of darkness or disillusionment charms. As they walked through the castle's grand corridors, random maids and liveried servants would stop their work and bow deeply as they passed. Harry found it a little weird, and frankly, a bit uncomfortable, as they were also bowing respectfully to him, simply because he was in the company of their queen. He wasn't used to that kind of deference. It is just up through here, Audiobook said, gesturing towards a wide, sweeping stairwell that led to the upper levels of the castle. Harry nodded and continued to follow her, his long black cloak swishing silently behind him. After ascending a few flights of marble stairs, they came to a beautiful, ornately carved wooden door. "Wait here," Audiobook told the two guards who had been trailing them silently. This command seemed to upset the guards once more, their already stern expressions tightening. "My lady," one of the guards started, his voice hesitant but clearly concerned, "I do not wish to question your judgment, but, wouldn't it be safer if we at least—" "We shall be perfectly fine," Audiobook cut him off, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "I have absolute faith that the Black Mage will look after me if any trouble should arrive. Why don't you both go and attend to my husband, the king? I'm sure he could use your diligence." The guards still looked decidedly uncomfortable, their eyes darting nervously towards Harry, but they bowed stiffly before reluctantly departing. With them finally gone, Audiobook turned back to the ornate door and gently pushed it open a crack. "Callanth, dearest?" Audiobook asked softly into the dimly lit room beyond. "Are you awake, my love?" "Mama!" A soft, weak voice replied from the darkness within. Audiobook entered the room and then gestured for Harry to do the same. Harry walked softly into the darkened room, his eyes quickly adjusting, and did a quick, cursory look around. It was decorated in a way in which he fully expected a young princess's private chambers to be decorated: plush carpets, expensive-looking tapestries, delicate, feminine furniture. The only unnatural, and rather telling, thing was that most of the furniture had been pushed haphazardly against the walls, as if to clear space, or perhaps to prevent someone from bumping into it in the dark. Harry moved closer to the large, canopied bed in the center of the room, where he got his first proper look at the young girl who would, if his calculations and Ciri's stories were correct, one day be Ciri's grandmother. Callanth. He'd heard the name correctly. She was a young, blonde-haired girl, probably around 7 or 8 years old, and she was incredibly, almost translucent, pale and alarmingly skinny. Most likely due, Harry surmised, to her prolonged illness. He also noticed small, angry-looking red spots, like a rash, on certain parts of her visible skin, her arms, her neck, that caused Harry's eyes to narrow in concern and dawning recognition. "I have brought a special man here today, Callanth, to look over you and see if he can help you feel better," Audiobook said gently, stroking her daughter's forehead. "Please, my sweet, listen to what he tells you, okay?" The girl, Callanth, seemed to nod weakly, her eyes fluttering open to look at her mother. Harry took that as his cue and walked quietly over to her bedside. He pulled up a nearby, ornate chair and sat down next to the frail-looking girl. "Hello, Callanth, was it?" Harry asked her gently, his voice soft and reassuring. He subtly, almost invisibly, cast a series of complex diagnostic charms on her as he spoke. "That's a very pretty name. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" I'm approaching my 8th year, sir," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up at him, her blue eyes surprisingly bright and intelligent despite her weakened state. "What is your name?" "My name?" Harry said, caught slightly off guard. He hadn't expected her to ask. "Ah, well, you can call me Apollo. It's a pleasure to meet you, Callanth." 8 years old, you said? Wow! You're getting pretty grown up then, aren't you? I'm sure, before you know it, you will be a beautiful, strong young maiden, and all the young boys in the kingdom will be clamoring for your attention someday." He finished his spells, the magical feedback already filtering into his mind. The girl managed a small, weak smile at his words. "Perhaps," she said, her voice still faint. "Or perhaps not." Harry had to physically keep himself from frowning. While the young girl didn't sound entirely defeated, not yet, she did seem to possess a grim, weary acceptance of the reality of her dire situation, far beyond her tender years. "Oh, I'm quite sure of it, Harry said with a confident smile he didn't entirely feel. Now, can you give me just a moment, Callanth? I'll be right back. He got up from the chair and went over to a small, elegant writing desk that was pushed against the far wall. He tapped his wand lightly on its polished wooden surface, and faint, shimmering words, visible only to him, began to appear on the wood, giving him the detailed magical diagnosis of the girl's condition. Queen Audelia, who had been watching him with a mixture of hope and anxiety, walked over to him while he was doing this. What are you doing? Audelia asked eagerly, her voice a hushed whisper, clearly trying to keep quiet so her daughter wouldn't overhear their conversation. Have you found what's wrong with her? If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 28, Cure. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. What are you doing? Audelia asked eagerly, her voice a hushed whisper, clearly trying to keep quiet so her daughter wouldn't overhear their conversation. Have you found what's wrong with her? Harry didn't answer immediately. He looked over the glowing magical words on the desk, his brow furrowing in concentration, then in dawning, grim recognition. He knew what he was looking at. He had only ever seen a case like this once before, many years ago, and it had not been nearly this bad, this advanced. Yes, Harry said finally, turning to face the anxious queen. Yes, I have found what ails her. Your daughter, Callanth, has a rare, magical variant of what my people call an autoimmune disease. Audelia frowned, her brow crinkling in confusion. An autoimmune disease? What does that mean, Apollo? She asked, her voice laced with fear. It basically means, Harry explained, keeping his voice low and calm, that her own body is confused. It's attacking itself. She was born with some magic in her blood, Queen Audelia. Not a huge amount, not like a fully trained sorceress, but what little magic was there, it was quite potent, quite strong. Since there was so little of it, however, her normal, non-magical body has somehow mistaken that innate magic for a foreign entity, like a virus or a bacteria, trying to invade it. So, her body's natural defenses are now basically attacking her own magical core, trying to kill it off, not realizing that, in doing so, it's also slowly, inexorably, killing her in the process. It's a very rare disease, even in its non-magical form. The magical variant, like this one, is even more so. I'm honestly quite surprised she has lasted this long, Your Majesty. Cases this severe, this advanced, are usually quite fatal, and much more quickly. Queen Audelia had tears forming in her eyes, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Is there nothing that can be done then? She asked, her voice choked with grief, still trying desperately to maintain her quiet volume so Callanth wouldn't hear. I believe I can probably trick her body back to normal, Harry said, his voice taking on a more professional, confident tone. Re-educate it, so to speak, into thinking that the magic inside of it is normal, that it belongs there. But I will need to grab a specific potion first, from my own supplies. It's a potion that will temporarily settle her body down, stop almost all non-vital bodily activity. Essentially, it will put her into a deep, magically induced coma, a state where she will be much more susceptible to my specialized healing methods. After I've completed the procedure, I can then give her the antidote to bring her safely out of it. However, Harry added, looking directly at Audelia, his green eyes serious, as one of her legal guardians, as her mother, I will need your explicit permission to continue with this procedure. He had slipped fully into his healer mode now, focused and direct. Audelia took a moment to wipe her tears, to compose herself, to get her emotions under some semblance of control. Will it hurt her? She asked, her voice still trembling. The procedure itself won't hurt her at all, not while she's in the coma, Harry reassured her. But she will likely feel quite sore, all over her body, for a few days afterwards, given how far the disease has already spread and how much internal damage her body has inflicted upon itself. She will also need a very strict, carefully managed diet and a certain amount of gentle, guided exercise each day for several weeks, perhaps even months, to help her regain her strength and get her back to full health. I can give you detailed notes on all of that after I finish the main procedure, if you would like. Audelia nodded, a flicker of hope returning to her tear-filled eyes. Then, before Harry could react, she reached out and hugged him tightly, her arms wrapping around him in a desperate, grateful embrace. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Harry just awkwardly patted her back a few times, a little unsure how to react to such an open display of emotion, until she finally let go. "Right," Harry said, clearing his throat. "Well, I need to pop back to my lab, my workshop, to get the potion I need. I will be right back. Don't worry." And with that, he operated away with a soft pop. He appeared in his current, rather messy little makeshift lab, a secure, warded cave a few miles outside of Sintra. He quickly ruffled through his magically expanded trunk, searching for a vial of the draught of living death, or at least, this world's closest alchemical equivalent of it, which he had painstakingly recreated some years ago. Grabbing the small, dark blue bottle, he then popped back to the palace, reappearing in Callanth's room just as silently as he had left. He saw Queen Audelia looking at him, her eyes wide with unconcealed surprise. I don't think I have ever seen even the most powerful sorcerer disappear and reappear quite like that before," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "Well," Harry said with a small, self-deprecating smile, "I've always been a little special, I suppose." He moved back over to Callanth's bedside. "Hello again, Callanth," Harry said gently, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "I have found out what's wrong with you. And I am going to put you to sleep for a little while, with this special potion I have here, so I can start the procedure to heal you properly. Don't be afraid, okay? I will give you the antidote to wake you up as soon as I am completely done." The little girl, despite her obvious weakness, did her very best to scowl at him, a spark of defiance glinting in her blue eyes. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice surprisingly firm for one so young and so ill. "I fear nothing. Not even death." She said it with a fierce, brave conviction that only a child, or perhaps a future warrior queen, could truly pull off. Harry couldn't help the small, fond laugh that escaped his mouth. "I bet you aren't, little lioness," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I just bet you aren't. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 29, Chapter 29, Contract. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Year 1251. Geralt's POV. "A dragon?" Geralt asked, his voice carefully neutral, though a hint of skepticism was already there. A dragon? It's a big black one, it is," the grizzled old farmer told him, his arms crossed stubbornly over his chest, his expression a mixture of fear and belligerence. Geralt just looked at the stubborn man, trying to gauge his honesty. Dragons were extremely rare, almost mythical creatures these days, hardly ever seen by anyone, let alone by some backwater farmer. It was far more likely, Gerald thought, that this was a simple case of mistaken identity, perhaps a large forked tail, or even a lizard, if the farmer was prone to exaggeration. "Does it breathe fire?" Gerald asked, trying to puzzle out if this was actually a dragon, or just some other, less impressive, draconid. "Well, it's a dragon, innit?" the farmer said, his voice tinged with what sounded like a growing, impatient anger. "So, I bloody well imagine it does breathe fire, doesn't it?" "Sure," Gerald said, letting the man's rudeness slide for now. "Who has it attacked? Any witnesses still alive?" he asked, hoping to see if there were any credible accounts of its behavior, anything to substantiate the dragon claim. "No one, not directly," the farmer admitted, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "It normally just flies around the mountains up there. But since it's there, everyone's too damn afraid to cross the mountains and go to Rivia, where we can sell our goods, see? It's bad for business, this dragon." "What's it been eating then?" Gerald observed, his mind already picking apart the farmer's story. "There's not much game up in those high mountain passes. It must have to come down sometime, for food. Surely someone would have seen that." "How the hell should I know what it eats?" the farmer snapped, finally getting well and truly frustrated with all of Gerald's pointed questions. "Are you going to go kill it or not, Witcher?" Gerald thought about it for a moment. This really didn't sound like typical dragon behavior to him, not at all. In fact, he very much doubted it was a true dragon at all. It was probably just some other, less dangerous draconid that these superstitious, ignorant farmers had confused for one. Still, a contract was a contract, and coin was coin. "All right," Gerald said, his voice calm. "I'll deal with it. I'll be back for my coin once the deed's done." The farmer nodded, apparently satisfied now that he was getting what he wanted. "About bloody time you accepted," the farmer grumbled, as if Gerald had been deliberately wasting his precious time. "I was beginning to think I was going to have to go hire someone else." He said it like it was some kind of dire threat. Gerald almost snorted at that, but he managed to keep his face carefully still, his expression unreadable. There weren't many witchers, or anyone else for that matter, who would willingly go after a supposed dragon for the paltry sum this farmer was offering. The real, professional dragon hunters, the ones who actually knew what they were doing, didn't even go after dragons for simple contract fees. They went after them for a chance to steal their legendary, treasure-filled hoards, once they'd, somehow, managed to kill the beast. As a general rule, Gerald himself tended to stay well away from true dragons. But in most cases like this, there were rarely any actual dragons involved. Gerald moved towards his horse, a sturdy, reliable brown stallion he had, of course, named Roach. He mounted him smoothly and looked up towards the imposing, snow-capped Mahakam Mountains. They looked no different than any other time he had passed through this region. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible kick to Roach's flanks to get him started towards the mountain range. He knew there were usually some reclusive inhabitants, hermits or prospectors, who lived up in the lower mountain areas, so hopefully, one of them could point him in the right general direction of this supposed dragon's lair. The climb up the winding mountain passes was surprisingly, almost eerily, peaceful. He had not encountered anything more dangerous than a few startled wild goats and some skittish mountain birds, all of which had scurried or flown away as soon as he had gotten near. He hadn't even encountered any wolves, which should have been much more abundant nearer to the bottom of the mountain range. That was odd. Still, he pushed on, ever upwards, towards the distant peaks. Eventually, the narrow, treacherous pass got too small, too difficult for a horse to navigate safely, and Gerald had to dismount and continue on foot. He was already quite high up at this point, the air thin and cold, so he wouldn't have to push much further to reach the highest peaks. He was actually a little surprised he hadn't found a nest, or a cave, or some other sign of whatever creature was supposedly nesting up here. There wasn't much mountain left above him, and that meant there was considerably less space for a large creature to have a suitably sized cave or a well-hidden nest. Still, he continued on, his Witcher senses on high alert. He had already taken the contract, and he always finished his contracts. He pushed up higher and higher, the path becoming steeper, the wind biting at his exposed skin. He was almost near the very top, the air razor thin, when he noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible hum against his chest. "Medallion is humming, Geralt said softly to himself, his hand instinctively going to the wolf head medallion that hung around his neck. He looked around, his yellow, cat-like eyes scanning his surroundings carefully. He was actually in a part of the trail where the narrow path had widened out considerably, forming a sort of small, rocky plateau. To his left was the obvious, dizzying long drop down to the bottom of the mountain range, a fall that would kill anything. To his right, however, there was a large, open, recessed space in the mountainside, partially obscured by a rocky overhang. Now that he looked at it more closely, his Witcher senses tingling, it looked almost like the cleverly concealed start of a cave. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 30, Big End. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Now that he looked at it more closely, his Witcher senses tingling, it looked almost like the cleverly concealed start of a cave. Geralt frowned, his hand resting on the hilt of his silver sword, and walked forward slowly, cautiously, until he was standing right near the seemingly solid rock wall. His wolf medallion hummed even louder now, vibrating insistently as he approached the wall. An illusion, he asked himself, his voice a low murmur. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the cold, smooth surface of the rock wall, only to see his hand sink right through it, as if it wasn't even there, as if it were made of mist. Geralt pushed forward, stepping through the illusory wall, as he confirmed his suspicion. As he pushed his way into the hidden space beyond the illusion, the one thing that Geralt definitely didn't expect to see was the most coziest, most unexpectedly domestic-looking cave he had ever seen in his entire, long life. The hidden cave had a comfortable, almost palpable warm feeling to it. Soft, magical torches were placed all around its surprisingly spacious interior, casting a gentle, flickering glow. There was a nice, crackling fireplace in the middle of the main chamber, with several expensive-looking, plush armchairs surrounding it. On one side of the cave, there was a large, open, empty space, where nothing had been done with the natural rock. Off to the other side, however, there were quite a few tall, well-stocked bookshelves, what looked like complex alchemical and laboratory equipment, though not like any he had ever seen before. It looked far more advanced, as well as a massive, inviting-looking king-sized bed. And in that king-sized bed, there appeared to be a man. A man sleeping quite comfortably, if his light, rhythmic snores were any indication. Geralt walked quietly up to the sleeping man and leaned down for a closer look. The man appeared to be quite young, probably in his early 20s, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and a thin, faded scar, shaped like a lightning bolt, just above one of his closed eyebrows. He reached over and gently, but firmly, shook the man awake. He wanted some answers, and he wanted them now. The man opened his eyes groggily, blinking a few times, and then stared up at Geralt with a look of pure, sleepy confusion. Can I help you with something?" the young man asked, his voice thick with sleep. Geralt just raised a single, unimpressed eyebrow. Not quite the startled, or perhaps fearful, response he had been expecting from the man. "Are you the one who has decorated this cave?" Geralt asked first, his voice a low rumble. The young man smiled at that, a surprisingly friendly, open smile. That I am, he said, his voice still a little hoarse. Why? Do you like it? The man asked, his tone now semi-excited, almost boyish. Gerald just looked at the man, his expression unchanging. It was quite possible, he considered, that this young fellow wasn't entirely, all there, mentally. Gerald looked around the surprisingly well-appointed cave again, then back at the man. Seems cozy, he said drily. The man nodded enthusiastically as he sat up and swung his legs out of the bed. Gerald noted that he was wearing a simple, clean-looking shirt and trousers, not typical sleeping attire. A little strange, as most people he knew slept either in their undergarments or in nothing at all. I thought so too, the man said cheerfully. That's sort of the vibe I was going for, you know? Wasn't really planning on having any guests, especially not so soon after waking up, but I guess it's not really a problem. What's your name, stranger? The young man asked, looking at Gerald with open, unabashed curiosity. Gerald of Rivia, he told the strange, surprisingly amiable young man. He didn't miss the very slight, almost imperceptible twitch that had appeared for a fraction of a second on the man's face as he gave his name. Interesting. I see, the young man said, his cheerful demeanor dimming slightly, replaced by a more thoughtful, almost contemplative expression. The date must be closing in then, mustn't it? I guess I should probably start making some preparations. He looked up at Gerald, his green eyes suddenly sharp and focused. Tell me, Gerald of Rivia. What year is it, exactly? The man asked, as he started moving about the cave, quickly and efficiently throwing on some more practical, outdoor clothes. It's the year 1251, Gerald stated, his yellow eyes fixed on the young man who was now rummaging through a pile of papers on a cluttered workbench. And I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind. He remembered why he was here, the contract, the supposed dragon. Shoot, the man, Harry, said absently, still focused on his papers, not even looking up. Shoot, what? Gerald asked, a flicker of confusion crossing his usually stoic features. The man just shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. Nothing. Just an old saying. Ask your questions, Witcher, Harry told him, his voice still a little distracted. Who are you, and what exactly are you doing in this cave? Gerald asked first, getting straight to the point. Name's Harry, the now identified Harry said simply, still not looking up. And I live here. You live in this cave? Gerald asked, his skepticism evident in his tone. It was a surprisingly comfortable cave, yes, but still a cave. That's what I said, isn't it? Harry confirmed, his attention still seemingly absorbed by the papers he was rifling through. Why? Gerald asked, his patience wearing thin. The privacy, for the most part, Harry said with a sigh, finally looking up for a moment. I usually have to change caves every few years, you know. People tend to find my current abode, sooner or later, and then they start bothering me with all sorts of nonsense. It's rather unfortunate, actually, as I just moved in here. Quite like the view. Gerald grunted, not particularly interested in the man's nomadic living arrangements. I don't suppose you've seen a dragon around since you've moved in here, have you? A big, black one, perhaps. A dragon? Harry asked, his head snapping up, his green eyes suddenly sharp and focused on Gerald. A big, black one, you say? Gerald's own eyes narrowed. That was exactly how the farmer had described it. He nodded slowly. Nah, Harry said, his expression suddenly, surprisingly, nonchalant again. Never seen it before in my life. Gerald looked at him, a flash of surprise, then suspicion, in his eyes. You haven't seen it, but you just described it perfectly, Gerald accused, his voice low and dangerous. I just said big and black, Harry pointed out, a small, amused laugh escaping his lips. That could be all sorts of things, couldn't it? I can think of plenty of other things, right off the top of my head, that are also big and black. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 31, Chapter 31, Dragon Cave. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. I just said big and black, Harry pointed out again, that small, amused, and frankly, irritating laugh escaping his lips once more. That could be all sorts of things, couldn't it? A big black bear, a particularly large raven, a very, very burnt piece of toast. I can think of plenty of other things, right off the top of my head, that are also big and black, Gerald. You have a rather one-track mind today. Gerald just stared at what he now firmly, and with ever-growing certainty, assumed was a complete and utter, certifiable crazy person. He tore his eyes off the man, deciding for the second time to pointedly ignore his nonsensical babbling, and let his gaze roam around the surprisingly spacious and well-appointed cave again. His Witcher senses were still on high alert. Something in the large, empty section of the cave, the part that hadn't been decorated with bookshelves and comfy armchairs, caught his attention once more. He quietly walked over to it, his boots making little sound on the stone floor, and got a closer, more detailed look. On the rough, uneven stone surface, there were several large, deeply gouged claw marks. Gerald's eyes widened considerably as he examined them with a professional, practiced eye. These claw marks were much, much too large, and spaced too far apart, to belong to a mere lizard or a common, everyday forked tail. These were, in fact, some of the biggest, most impressive, and frankly, terrifying, dragon claw marks he had ever seen in his long, monster hunting career. There was no longer any doubt in his mind, not a single shred. This was, indeed, a dragon's cave. A very large dragon's cave. He turned sharply, his expression grim, towards the strange, unsettlingly cheerful, and apparently oblivious young man. "We need to leave," Gerald said, his voice urgent, low, and filled with a grim, no-nonsense warning. "Now. Right now." The man, Harry, just looked up at him from the papers he was still shuffling, a mildly surprised, almost put upon expression on his face. "Oh, you're leaving already? So soon? That's a shame, I was just about to offer you some tea." "Well, I wish you the best of luck on the road then, Gerald. Safe travels, try not to get eaten by any grickens," Harry said, and then he promptly, infuriatingly, continued to quickly, almost frantically, rifle through some more of his damned pages, as if Gerald hadn't just issued a clear, unambiguous, life-or-death warning. Gerald frowned, his patience, which was never particularly abundant to begin with, completely and utterly gone now. He quickly strode up to the man, grabbed him roughly by one arm, spun him around to face him, and glared down at him with all the focused, deadly intensity he could possibly muster. "Listen to me very carefully, you infuriating little fool," Gerald said, his voice a low, threatening growl that had made hardened criminals wet themselves. "I don't know who you are, or why you're here, or what kind of game you think you're playing, but you picked the absolute wrong cave to move into. This is the cave of a very large, very powerful, and most likely very territorial, dragon. We need to leave, before it comes back and finds us trespassing in its lair. So, grab whatever little trinkets you can carry, and we're leaving. Now." He put as much raw menace and deadly urgency into his tone as he possibly could. Most sensible people, even brave ones, would cave into him at this point. They would do exactly what he told them, for the very simple, very understandable, fear of their own lives. Sadly, this strange, infuriating young man just looked back at him with an expression of mild, almost bored, profound annoyance. Man, you are really hung up on this whole dragon thing, aren't you? Harry said with an exasperated sigh. Though, I guess I shouldn't really be too surprised, knowing you and all, your rather famous reputation, I mean. He paused, then a thoughtful, almost mischievous look crossed his face. All right, look. Can you keep a secret, Gerald of Rivia? A really big one? One that might just blow your Witcher mind? Harry finally asked him, his green eyes sparkling with something unreadable. Gerald just looked at the man, his mind already rapidly debating whether he would need to simply, and for the man's own good, knock him unconscious and drag him bodily out of the cave. It seemed the only way to save this suicidal idiot from himself. Okay, stop right there, Harry said, holding up a placating hand, somehow, impossibly, sensing Gerald's violent intentions. I know that look. That's your I'm about to punch someone very hard look. You're planning to hit me, aren't you? I never realized she got that particular, rather intimidating scowl from you, you know. Interesting family resemblance. He paused, then his tone suddenly became more serious, more direct. Look, Gerald, Harry said, perhaps I should just show you. Words clearly aren't getting through that thick Witcher skull of yours. Gerald just furrowed his eyebrows, his confusion deepening into outright bewilderment. The man was speaking absolute, complete nonsense, as far as he was concerned. He opened his mouth to respond, to tell the man he was wasting precious, potentially life-saving time, but he suddenly found his hands empty, the man he'd been gripping so firmly vanishing with the distinct, sharp pop of magical apparition. His eyes widened in genuine shock, and he instinctively, lightning fast, drew his silver sword, dropping into a ready, defensive stance, his senses screaming. You are actually about as paranoid, and as quick on the draw, as I thought you would be, a familiar, amused voice said from behind him. Gerald spun around, his movements fluid and deadly, and saw the man called Harry standing back near the emptiest part of the cave, right where he had first seen those massive, terrifying dragon claw marks. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 32, Revealed. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. You are actually about as paranoid, and as quick on the draw, as I thought you would be, a familiar, amused voice said from behind him. Gerald spun around, his movements fluid and deadly, and saw the man called Harry standing back near the emptiest part of the cave, right where he had first seen those massive, terrifying dragon claw marks. Gerald said nothing, his silver sword held steady, glinting in the torchlight, his Witcher senses on full alert, screaming at him about the sheer, raw power emanating from the young man. He didn't know what to expect from this enigmatic, infuriating man now, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was either incredibly, unnaturally fast or he possessed magic of a level he had rarely, if ever, encountered before. One meant he was most likely a higher vampire, or some other incredibly dangerous, powerful creature. The other, magic on that scale, could potentially be just as troublesome, just as deadly, as he, more than anyone, knew from certain, previous, rather complicated, and often painful, relations he had had in the past. Do me a favor, Gerald, Harry said, his voice surprisingly calm, almost conversational, given the circumstances. Try not to kill me, or run away screaming like a little girl, when I change, all right? It's a bit disconcerting, and frankly, a little insulting, when people do that. Gerald still said nothing, his muscles tensed, coiled like a viper, preparing himself for what could possibly, very likely, be a fight for his very life. He expected the man to either charge him with inhuman, blinding speed, or to start launching devastating, ranged magical attacks, as most powerful mages he'd encountered specialized in. What he did not expect, not in a million years, not even in his wildest, most fevered dreams, was for the young man to suddenly drop onto all fours, his body beginning to rapidly, impossibly, terrifyingly, expand and darken. He watched, stunned into a rare, almost complete immobility, as the man continued to grow, his human form shifting and contorting in a way that defied all known laws of biology and magic, until he was almost the full, dizzying height of the enormous cave, his scales as black as the deepest, starless night itself, his intelligent, slitted eyes burning with a familiar, piercing emerald light. By now, Gerald knew exactly, precisely, without a shadow of a doubt, what he was looking at. A dragon. A very, very big, very black, and very, very real dragon. The one from the contract. The one whose cave this apparently was. "You're a dragon?" Gerald asked, his voice filled with a mixture of profound astonishment, utter disbelief, and a dawning, horrified, and deeply confused understanding. "Did you hit your head or something in the middle of my rather impressive, and if I may say so myself, quite seamless transformation, Witcher?" the colossal black dragon said, its voice a deep, resonant, echoing rumble that vibrated through the very stone beneath Gerald's feet, yet somehow, still undeniably, recognizably, Harry's familiar, slightly sarcastic voice. "I'm clearly a black dragon, as you can plainly, and I hope, appreciatively, see." I don't understand," Gerald stammered, instinctively lowering his silver sword slightly, though he still kept it gripped tightly in his hand, just in case. Old habits died hard. How can you change shape like that, if you are a dragon?" Dragons were dragons. They didn't just turn into young men with messy black hair and annoying grins. "Ah, that's where you're a bit mistaken, Gerald, my friend," the dragon-man explained, its massive, obsidian head tilting slightly, its emerald eyes glinting with amusement. "I am not a dragon that can somehow, magically, turn into a man. Rather, I am a man that can, among other rather interesting things, turn into a dragon. I am a mage, a wizard, from somewhere else. And this," it gestured with a colossal, clawed foreleg, "is just one of my many abilities. It shouldn't surprise you too much, I wouldn't think. I have certainly heard of other mages, in this world and others, who can achieve something vaguely similar, some form of transfiguration or polymorphing, even if it's not usually to this particular, rather impressive, and admittedly somewhat dramatic, extent." Gerald processed that rather mind-boggling, world-view-shattering piece of information for a long, silent second, his Witcher brain struggling to catch up, to make sense of the impossible thing he was witnessing. So you're not a real dragon then?" he asked, still needing absolute clarification, his mind reeling. "This is just some kind of fancy, incredibly oversized, and frankly, terrifying, transformation spell." "That's a hard question to answer definitively," Harry explained, rubbing his chin thoughtfully while Gerald listened, his expression carefully neutral. "When you take on another form in the way I have done, when you truly become the creature, you do, in a very real sense, become that creature. You even begin to gain some of the creature's innate tendencies, its instincts. And if you're not careful, if you're not strong-willed enough, you can fully lose yourself to that new form, to its primal nature. So, to answer your question, Gerald, yes, and no. It is a transformation, a magical one, but it doesn't make me any less of a dragon when I am in that form." "I see," Gerald said, though his brow remained furrowed. "And what specific tendencies, as you call them, have you gained due to this transformation of yours?" he asked, clearly trying to gauge if this man-dragon ate like a dragon, hoarded gold like one, or perhaps had other, more problematic, dragon-like behaviors. Sharpened senses, for the most part, Harry said, ticking them off on his fingers. My sight, hearing, smell, all of them are significantly enhanced, even in my human form, though not to the same degree as when I'm fully transformed. That, as well as the undeniable want, and the actual physical ability, to hibernate during the colder months, those are the main things, really. Gerald scrunched his brow at that last part. Dragons don't hibernate, he stated, his voice laced with a hint of suspicion. He knew his dragon lore. The ones here, in this world, certainly don't, Harry said with a nod. They are also, as you may have noticed, not nearly as big, or as magically powerful, as I am either. Gerald took that to mean that the specific type of dragon this man, Harry, transformed into was either not native to these lands at all, or perhaps it was a whole new, previously undocumented species altogether. Both options would make a certain amount of sense, which, frustratingly, made it harder to pick which theory to lean towards. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 33, Unexpected Meeting. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Gerald took that to mean that the specific type of dragon this man, Harry, transformed into was either not native to these lands at all, or perhaps it was a whole new, previously undocumented species altogether. Both options would make a certain amount of sense, which, frustratingly, made it harder to pick which theory to lean towards. Humph. Gerald grunted, a sound of reluctant acceptance. Well, I guess I can't exactly complete the contract that was given to me then, can I? He said, as he finally, fully sheathed his silver blade and stared, with a lingering sense of disbelief, at the now rapidly shrinking, shifting form of the massive black dragon. Soon, the man named Harry from earlier, looking remarkably unruffled, was standing in its place. It was still almost unbelievable to witness. Yes, well, perhaps I can help you with that little issue, Harry said, a friendly smile on his face. I have, quite a substantial sum of money tucked away. Perhaps I can repay you for your lost fee. How much were you getting paid for this, dragon-slaying contract, anyway? Harry asked, as he moved over to one of his shrunken trunks, which he'd apparently just unshrunk from a necklace he wore. You don't need to do that, Gerald told the man, his pride pricking him slightly. I'll be fine. Not the first contract to go sideways. Nonsense, Harry insisted, rummaging around in the trunk. I know how witchers live, how important these contracts are to your livelihood. You were probably going to get quite a hefty reward for slaying a dragon of my reputation. Go ahead and tell me. I insist. Eventually, after a bit more back and forth, Gerald finally, grudgingly, told him the amount. 250 orens. Harry exclaimed, looking genuinely surprised, even a little offended on Gerald's behalf. That's it? For a dragon? Man, times must be really tough for you witchers if that's the going rate for dragon slaying these days. He pulled out a small pouch of clinking coins. Well, Gerald admitted, I didn't actually believe you to truly be a dragon when I first accepted the contract. The descriptions I was given didn't really match up with typical dragon behavior. Still, he added, his expression turning more serious, the fact that there's even a word out now that a dragon is residing in these mountains, that will cause dragon hunters, real ones, to come running. Especially if the claims of your size are verified. I would strongly advise you to leave this area, if you don't want constant trouble. Gerald himself was already preparing to head out, his work here clearly, and rather unexpectedly, concluded. Humph. Well, that's certainly an annoyance, Harry said, though he didn't seem overly concerned. Here is the coin, he said, handing Gerald a pouch that felt considerably heavier than 250 orens. 300 orens. The extra 50 is for your troubles, and for the sound advice. Harry offered him a kind, genuine smile. Gerald nodded, accepting the coin. I appreciate it, he said, his voice sincere. I wish you well on your future travels, Harry. He began walking backwards, towards the entrance of the cave. And you, Gerald of Rivia, Harry said, his smile taking on that enigmatic quality again. I have a strong feeling that we will meet again, at some point, down the road. As he finished speaking, he, and the conjured chairs, and the trunk, and everything else in the cave that hadn't been there when Gerald arrived, simply vanished, with a soft, almost inaudible pop. Gerald's cat-like eyes widened for a brief moment in surprise at the sudden disappearance, then he shook his head, a wry smirk playing on his lips. This Harry was certainly full of surprises. He turned and left the now empty, silent cave. 1252, Sintra. Harry's POV. Harry stayed hidden, silent and unseen, in the deep shadows of the royal bedchamber. Loud, agonizing screams of pain were echoing throughout the dimly lit room. Harry, however, wasn't paying much attention to the screaming, or to the many flustered, scurrying handmaidens running frantically around the room. Instead, he simply sat in a dark corner, hidden by a complex web of disillusionment and silencing charms, calmly reading a book while he waited. He even had a secondary sound-dampening charm active around his immediate person, just to lower the volume of the incoming sounds, because the screaming, frankly, was getting a bit much, even for him. Harry was currently engrossed in a rather dry, academic book on the theory and practical usage of magical portals by what he considered to be normal mages, those without his unique advantages. They seemed so horribly medieval, so clunky and inefficient, when compared to the elegance and speed of apparition. You also, apparently, could not reliably use them in active combat, which, in Harry's opinion, was a complete waste of a potentially useful magical transportation method. Apparition, with enough skill and practice, could most certainly be used effectively in combat situations. Portals, he noted, also seemed to work similarly to apparition in one crucial, and rather dangerous, aspect: if you didn't know exactly where you were going, if your visualization was off, you could potentially end up, anywhere. Or nowhere at all. Despite their numerous faults and limitations, however, portals were generally considered much safer than apparition, mainly because there wasn't really a chance to accidentally splinch yourself to leave bits of your body behind if you did it wrong. If you messed up a portal creation, it would most likely just not work at all. Harry finally raised his head from his book when he noticed that the incessant screaming in the room had, at long last, stopped. A new, much smaller, and considerably more welcome sound had taken its place: the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. He looked over towards the large, ornate bed in the center of the room and noticed that most of the harried handmaidens had now left, with only one, older-looking one remaining, tidying up. An additional man and woman, however, had just entered the room. The new woman who had entered was familiar to him, especially since he had, rather discreetly, saved her life from a nasty political assassination attempt not too many years ago. Callanth Fiona Ryanan, the formidable lioness of Sintra, was now the reigning queen of Sintra, as well as being, as of just a few moments ago, a brand new grandmother. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 34, Chapter 34, A Quiet Watcher. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Calanth Fiona Ryanan, the formidable lioness of Sintra, was now the reigning queen of Sintra, as well as being, as of just a few moments ago, a brand new grandmother. One wouldn't necessarily be able to tell this just by looking at her face, though. She still looked remarkably, almost unnaturally, young and vibrant, as she was only, by his calculations, about 33 years old. The other man in the room, tall and dark-haired, was apparently named Dooney, and he was, Harry knew, the father of the newly born baby girl. Ciri, in her own time, had never talked much about her biological father, but Harry had always gotten the distinct, unspoken feeling that she wasn't exactly fond of the man. Looking at him now, though, Harry couldn't immediately see anything overtly wrong with him. He seemed genuinely, completely overjoyed by the tiny, swaddled bundle resting in his arms, as did everyone else in the room. The woman who had just given birth, Princess Pavita, Calanth's daughter, looked utterly exhausted, pale and drawn, but she still managed a weak, radiant smile as she looked on at her newly born daughter as well. "Well," Queen Calanth asked, her voice surprisingly gentle as she looked at her daughter, "what have you decided to name the girl?" "Cirilla," Pavita responded, her voice soft and tired, but filled with an overwhelming, adoring love as she gazed at her new child. "It is a wonderful name, my love," Dooney told his exhausted wife, his own eyes shining with paternal pride. "A name truly fit for a princess." Harry just watched, unseen, as the new little family cooed and fussed over the tiny, newborn girl. Harry was, of course, happy that there was a new life in the world, and he was genuinely happy for the family's obvious joy and happiness over the situation. But that was not actually why he was here, lurking in the shadows of a royal birthing chamber. It wouldn't make any sense for him to go through all his meticulous, painstaking work to avoid Ciri, to avoid interfering with her timeline, and then just randomly show up at her birth simply to see her. No, he was here for a much more specific, much more crucial reason. He was here simply to verify, with his own eyes, that this particular baby, this Cirilla, was indeed the Ciri he knew, the Ciri he had loved, the Ciri he was waiting for. He already knew, with a certainty that sometimes chilled him to the bone, that he had, by his very presence in this world, changed history to some extent, created ripples in the fabric of time. He needed to be absolutely sure that those changes hadn't altered things to such a drastic extent that his Ciri, the Ciri of his memories, no longer existed, or was somehow, different. He waited, with the patience of a man who had lived for decades, for what felt like hours, for them to finally take the baby from her exhausted mother and place her gently in a nearby, ornate crib, to allow Pavita to rest and recover. Harry had to consciously, forcefully, squash the healer in him, the ingrained instinct to step forward and offer his assistance, to help them deal with the aftermath of the difficult birth. He couldn't interfere. Not yet. They were using horribly outdated, almost barbaric, methods to ensure Pavita's health after the birth, and Harry, with his extensive knowledge of advanced healing magic, just wanted to swoop in, shove them all aside, and show them how it was properly done. He could have stabilized her, eased her pain, and ensured a much quicker, safer recovery in a matter of minutes. He was, luckily, and perhaps a little sadly, quite used to squashing his natural, helpful tendencies at this point. Years of living in a world that wasn't his own, of needing to remain unseen and uninvolved in most matters, had taught him a harsh patience. So, he waited. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of hushed whispers and rustling linens, they carefully put little baby Ciri into her ornate crib and then, at long last, vacated the room to allow the exhausted mother to sleep. Harry waited, silent and invisible, until he was sure Princess Pavita had finally fallen into a deep, restorative sleep. Only then did he approach the crib, still hidden under his complex layers of charms. He stared down at the tiny, sleeping child, who was still squirming a little in her sleep, her tiny fists clenched, her face a perfect, miniature version of the one he knew so well. Harry reached out, not with his physical hand, but with his magic, a gentle, probing tendril of his own considerable power, to touch, to sense, little Ciri's nascent magical signature. He needed to see if it matched the unique, vibrant, chaotic signature of the Ciri he remembered, the Ciri he had loved, the Ciri he was waiting for. Everyone's magical signature, he knew, was as unique as their blood, as their very soul. This was the only way he could truly, definitively tell if they were, in fact, the same person, if his Ciri had indeed been born into this world, unaltered by his presence. He waited a moment, his breath held, as he carefully, delicately, analyzed the faint, flickering magical aura emanating from the sleeping infant. And then, a slow, relieved, incredibly happy smile spread across his face. A perfect match. Undeniably, unmistakably, her. Harry smiled down with pure, unadulterated happiness at the tiny, sleeping girl. I shall see you again soon, Ciri, Harry thought, a warmth spreading through his chest that had been absent for far too long. And then, as silently and as invisibly as he had arrived, he disappeared from the royal bedchamber with a soft, barely perceptible pop, leaving no trace that he had ever been there, with no one in the castle the wiser. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 35, Chapter 35, Tales over Ale. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. 1255. Harry's POV. When Harry casually strolled into this particular dingy, smoke-filled inn, in this particular nondescript, forgettable little village, he never, in a million years, expected to see a highly visible, instantly recognizable splash of ashen-white hair at one of the corner tables. His heart gave a sudden, hopeful lurch. A familiar, bulky, muscular form accompanied the splash of ashen hair, however, a form that was far too broad-shouldered and, well, male, to be who he had first, for a fleeting, delirious moment, confused it to be. It also wouldn't make any logical sense if it was her, as his Ciri should still be a mere toddler at this point in the timeline, barely able to walk, let alone frequenting shady taverns. But his second, more rational thought, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, seemed to be the correct one. Geralt of Rivia. He walked over to the table and saw that Geralt, the infamous Witcher, had 3 companions with him. 2 strikingly beautiful, exotically dressed women, and a rather distinguished, though somewhat oddly dressed, man who sat in the middle of them, directly across from Geralt. Evening, Geralt, Harry said cheerfully, pulling up a spare stool. My, it's been quite some time since we last saw each other, hasn't it? When was it exactly? The castle, with the Callanth business? Oh, no, that's right, it was in that chilly cave, with the rather unfortunate contract. Harry said to the surprised-looking Witcher. He had forgotten for a brief second that Geralt hadn't actually known that Harry had been present, albeit invisibly, that chaotic night in Sintra, when Geralt had been summoned to drive away Ciri's father, Dooney, by Queen Callanth's rather forceful command. That had been a most amusing, and highly informative, night to observe. Harry. Geralt said, his golden, cat-like eyes widening slightly in genuine surprise. What in the blazes are you doing here? In a place like this? Oh, you know me, Geralt, Harry said with a casual, easygoing shrug. I just sort of, pop in and out of places. Wherever the wind, or my fancy, takes me. He sat down next to the Witcher, as there wasn't really any room on the other side of the rather crowded table. Geralt grunted, his expression still laced with suspicion. So, you just happened to be traveling into this exact same tiny, middle-of-nowhere town as me, at this exact same time? No other reason at all. Harry looked at him with a single, perfectly arched eyebrow. Gerald, my friend, Harry asked, his tone a mixture of semi-serious bewilderment and semi-joking amusement, what possible thing do you honestly think I could possibly need your help with? Me. Gerald actually looked like he was seriously considering that question for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. I suppose, nothing, then, he finally conceded, a hint of a reluctant smile playing on his lips. Exactly, Harry said with a satisfied nod. So, are you going to introduce me to your rather intriguing friends here? I haven't met anyone new in ages, it feels like. Harry said with a friendly smile as he looked across the table at the unknown man and his two silent, watchful female companions. That's Borch 3 Jackdaws, Gerald said, with a short, curt nod at the distinguished-looking man. And his two companions are Tia and Vea. He indicated each of the women with another brief nod, so Harry could tell the difference between the two, who looked remarkably, almost unnervingly, similar. A pleasure to meet you all, Harry said to them, his smile genuine and welcoming. My name is Harry. It didn't escape his notice, not for a second, that the man, Borch, smelled faintly, but unmistakably, of brimstone and ancient magic. He smelled of a dragon. And Harry, of all people, would certainly know that scent. A pleasure to meet you as well, Harry, Borch said, his own smile polite and intelligent, as he deftly poured some dark, foaming ale into a spare, slightly chipped cup and handed it to Harry. Harry took it gratefully. Oh, please, do continue with your discussion, Harry said, taking a tentative sip of the ale. It was surprisingly good, rich, and malty. Don't let me interrupt. I happen to have quite the fascination with the creatures myself. Gerald snorted quietly into his own drink at that massive understatement, a sound Harry pointedly ignored. Well, to be specific, my dear Harry, Borch said, his eyes twinkling with interest, we were just discussing the rather fascinating topic of golden dragons. And whether they could perhaps be mere myths, legends spun by fanciful storytellers, or perhaps, as Gerald here suggests, some sort of rare, undocumented mutants of the common dragon species. And again, Gerald interjected, his voice a low grumble, if they were mutants, then they have most likely died out by now. Such unique variations rarely last long in the wild. Well, Harry said, setting his cup down with a soft thud, you're both wrong. Oh? Borch asked, leaning forward slightly, a curious, almost eager look on his face. So you believe in them then, Harry? You think golden dragons are real? Of course, they're real, Harry said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Beautiful creatures, they are. And insanely, incredibly smart too. Wiser than most humans I've met, that's for sure. He took another appreciative swig of his drink. This ale really was quite good. You've met one? Borch asked, his voice now laced with open surprise, his companions, Tia and Vea, also looking at Harry with newfound, intense interest. Met is perhaps too strong a word, Harry clarified. I observed him, for a while. From a safe distance, of course. He seemed like a pleasant enough sort, for a dragon. Just sort of, flew around, minding his own business, ate things mostly large game, thankfully in a certain rather remote mountain range he inhabited. He tended to avoid people, humans especially, and went to quite extraordinary lengths to do so. I almost missed him entirely when I first caught a glimpse of him, a flash of gold against the Sunday. Harry said to them, his voice taking on a slightly wistful, reminiscent tone. The three new people at the table, Borch, Tia, and Vea, seemed to be hanging on his every word. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 36, Chapter 36, Dragon Lore. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. The three new people at the table, Borch, Tia, and Vea, seemed to be hanging on his every word. Fascinating, Borch breathed, his eyes shining. When was this, Harry? How long ago did you observe this magnificent creature? Harry tilted his head up, as if searching his memory. Well, let's see now. He mused. It's currently the year 1255, if I'm not mistaken, so, it must have been about, 70 to 80 years ago, I'd say. Give or take 5 years, of course. My memory for exact dates isn't what it used to be. 70 years ago. Borch exclaimed, a little too loudly, drawing a few curious glances from the other patrons of the Rowdy Inn. My dear fellow, how old do you expect us to believe you are? Oh, about a century, I suppose, Harry said with his most mischievous, unrepentant smirk, as he casually downed the rest of his drink in one smooth gulp. Give or take a decade, here or there. You have a truly wild imagination, my friend Harry, Borch said, shaking his head, though he was smiling, clearly amused by Harry's outlandish claim. It's one of the many interesting things I have, yes, Harry replied, his smirk widening. You also said, Borch continued, his curiosity apparently insatiable, that Gerald and I were both wrong in our thoughts on what, exactly, a golden dragon is. So, enlighten us, Harry. What do you think it is? A golden dragon, Harry explained, his tone becoming more serious, more academic, is simply a dragon that got incredibly lucky, a dragon that benefited greatly from its parents' considerable success and longevity. You see, when a common dragon, a particularly powerful and long-lived one, is able to absorb and store up truly huge amounts of ambient magic in its body, over its entire, very long lifetime, it is then, and only then, possible for it to give birth to a golden dragon. He paused, making sure he had their full attention. Normal dragons, you see, have no real other biological use for all that excess magic they accumulate. So, when they finally lay their eggs, their body naturally, instinctively, condenses all the vast amounts of magic they have stored up over centuries, and then it presses that concentrated magic, infuses it, directly into the egg, or eggs. The baby dragon developing inside then absorbs that potent, concentrated magic into its own being. It uses it to first strengthen its body, to make it more resilient, more powerful, and then also to significantly strengthen its fiery breath, making it hotter, more destructive. This, by the way, is also why the firstborn dragons in a clutch are usually, though not always, noticeably stronger and more dominant than their later hatching siblings. Harry finished his explanation, and then he saw that he had the rapt, completely undivided attention of everyone at the table, including, much to his amusement, even the usually stoic and world-weary Gerald of Rivia. The problem, Harry continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, is that usually, dragons give birth to multiple babies at the same time, in a single clutch. The magic that the parent has stored up then has to be distributed amongst all the developing babies. The oldest, the first to hatch, typically gets the most, and the youngest, the last to hatch, gets the least. The sheer, almost unimaginable, amount of raw magic required to even have a chance of creating a golden dragon is so immense that there can only be one single, solitary baby to absorb it all, as well as an extremely large, ancient, and magically saturated parent to provide it in the first place. So, he concluded, sitting back with a satisfied air. You can see now why they are so incredibly rare. The very specific, almost impossible, circumstances required for their birth are just very, very hard to accomplish. Which is why only one, maybe 2, are ever seen in any given century, or even 2. Harry explained all this with a confident, academic air. He may have, he admitted to himself, done a little more than simply observe the last golden dragon he had encountered all those years ago. But in his defense, it had actually been no problem at all for him to figure out the biological and magical mechanics of how they were born. Nundus, back on his home world, were born in a remarkably similar way, though on a much more successful, and frankly, terrifying, scale. As soon as he had recognized the telltale magical signs of that type of singular, high magic birth with the last golden dragon he'd studied, he knew, with almost complete certainty, how they were created. A fascinating theory, my dear Harry, Borch said, his eyes alight with intellectual excitement. One I had admittedly never once thought of. How sure of this theory are you, if I may ask? Harry shrugged, a gesture that was both casual and deeply confident. Very sure, he told them. But not quite completely. I would bet quite heavily on it, but as I've learned over the years, there is always room for error, for some unknown variable, no matter how much you try to account for it, no matter how much you try to change or control the outcome. How absolutely fascinating, Borch mused. He then turned to Gerald with a good-natured, teasing smile. You still think it's just a matter of simple mutants, after hearing all that, my dear Gerald? Gerald gave a little, noncommittal grunt, a sound that was very typical of him. If Harry says it's magic that makes them the way they are, he said, taking another long chug of his drink, then I'm sure he would know better than me on the subject. You have much faith in this man, Borch declared, looking at Harry with renewed interest. You must be quite something indeed, Harry, to impress such a famously stoic and skeptical witcher. Harry smiled, a polite, almost humble smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I only know what I know, he said simply. So, he added, deftly changing the subject, you never actually told me what the two of you are doing in this rather random, out-of-the-way pub. Are you traveling somewhere together? Gerald shook his head. Just got finished with a contract, he grumbled. Basilisk. A nasty one. And then some of the local villagers decided they wanted to help themselves to my things, my pay, while I was down in the sewers taking care of it for them. Borch, however, he said, nodding towards the other man with a look of genuine gratitude, managed to discourage them, until I arrived. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 37, Chapter 37, Journal. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Gerald shook his head. Just got finished with a contract, he grumbled. Basilisk. A nasty one. And then some of the local villagers decided they wanted to help themselves to my things, my pay, while I was down in the sewers taking care of it for them. Borch, however, he said, nodding towards the other man with a look of genuine gratitude, managed to discourage them, until I arrived. Harry looked at the dragon-smelling man, Borch, impressed. Not many ordinary men were willing to stand up for a witcher, especially not against a mob of angry, ungrateful villagers. Well, Harry said, smiling warmly at the man, that was incredibly decent of him. Borch just tilted his head in a silent, graceful acknowledgement of the praise. Well, Harry said, suddenly pushing himself up from his seat on the rough wooden bench, it was truly nice catching up with you, Gerald, and a real pleasure meeting your lovely acquaintances. Unfortunately, I find myself terribly busy these days, and I really must be off once more. Ah, Borch said, looking genuinely disappointed. Are you sure, my friend? You must stay. Me and Gerald still haven't even ordered our food yet. You should stay and eat with us, share another drink. Unfortunately, Harry said with a sigh of what sounded like genuine regret, I simply don't have the time. I wish you all well on your journeys. Gerald, he said, turning to the Witcher with a knowing look, I'm sure we'll run into each other again, sometime down the road. Au revoir. And with that, before anyone could even say goodbye, he disappeared with an almost silent, barely perceptible pop. Gerald's POV. Gerald sat by a crackling fire, staring into the dancing flames. Dandelion, the ever-dramatic bard, was passed out cold on the ground near him, snoring softly, a half-empty bottle of cheap wine still clutched in his hand. On the other side of the fire, Yennefer sat, still and silent, engrossed in a thick, leather-bound book. They had just left the high, wind-swept mountain peaks where they had encountered the Golden Dragon, who, as it turned out, was none other than their recent acquaintance, Borch 3 Jackdaws. That had certainly been a surprise, perhaps even more surprising than when he had first met the enigmatic and impossibly old Harry. In the end, he had not slayed the dragon. Instead, he had simply listened to what the Golden Dragon had to say, and then watched as the idiot dwarves and the even more idiotic king had almost gotten him and Yen killed, after they had refused to honor their end of the deal with their knight, Ake of Dinasl. Borch, in his dragon form, had dealt with them all nicely enough, sending them packing with their tails between their legs. Yennefer hadn't been in a particularly great mood ever since they had left the mountain. She didn't seem quite as upset with him as she had been, but he could tell she was deeply, bitterly disappointed about not getting the dragon parts she had so desperately wanted, the parts she believed could cure her infertility. Gerald could understand, he really could. He knew how much Yennefer truly, desperately wanted to have a child of her own at some point. He looked at her now, at her beautiful, stern profile silhouetted against the firelight, and against his better judgment, he decided to try and talk to her. What are you reading? Gerald asked, his voice a low rumble, trying to make some simple, harmless conversation. Yennefer just looked up at him, her violet eyes flashing with their patented, "You're a complete and utter imbecile" look, a look Gerald was, by now, very, very used to. What am I reading? She repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. Why, Gerald? What could you possibly get out of knowing? Are you suddenly going to engage me in a deep, intellectual conversation about it? Astound me with your surprising, hidden knowledge on obscure magical personages and ancient texts. Gerald just shrugged, unfazed by her sharp tone, and looked at her, waiting patiently for her to answer his simple question. Yennefer looked at him for a long moment, the firelight dancing in her eyes, before she seemed to cool down slightly, a sigh escaping her lips. It was clear she might still not be in the best of moods. It is a journal, she said finally, her voice softer now, from a sorcerer I believe to be the infamous Black Mage. Gerald's eyebrows furrowed at that. Who's the Black Mage? He asked, the name unfamiliar to him. The Black Mage, Yennefer explained, her voice taking on a more academic tone, is a rather infamous, almost legendary, mage who is said to be immortal, or at the very least, incredibly long-lived. He wanders the lands, doing a strange, unpredictable mixture of incredibly helpful and frankly, quite frightening things. He is said to be an unparalleled expert in almost all forms of magic, as well as being extremely, almost supernaturally, elusive. He has been a frequent, and often heated, topic of discussion in the magical community for almost a century now. Many thought he was an elf at first, given some of his pro-elven actions and his apparent longevity. That theory was disproved, though, as any who have had the rare chance to actually glimpse him have stated that he looks nothing like an elf, nor does he possess a single discernible elven feature. Gerald thought on that for a moment. Sounds impressive, he grunted. You say you think you may have found his journal. What makes you unsure that it's legitimate? Several things, Yennefer admitted, looking down at the book in her hands with a skeptical expression. The most prominent being that I bought it off a traveling merchant on his way to Vizima for just a few measly orans. He said he found it in a cave he had used for a camp one night, tucked away in a crevice. He knew it was the journal of a mage from having read some of it himself, but he couldn't make heads or tails of most of it. It would have been all too easy for him to have written it himself, to have faked it, just to make a quick coin off a gullible sorceress. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 38, Chapter 38, Dragon. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Yet you still believe it, for some reason, Geralt observed, his voice a low rumble. Yennefer turned her head and eyed him for a long, calculating moment. I do, she finally admitted. Anyone who truly knows of the Black Mage, who has studied the legends and reports surrounding him, could possibly recognize this as his authentic journal. It's in the details. It recounts some of the very specific, often bizarre, experiences that the Black Mage is known for, with a level of intimate, personal detail that would be almost impossible to fake convincingly. And if the merchant were trying to pass it off as a real artifact, if he were a clever forger, then he would have undoubtedly tried to sell it for a lot more money, meaning he probably sold it for so little because he didn't actually know about the Black Mage's true infamy. Therefore, it is very unlikely he wrote it himself. Still, she added, her brow furrowing slightly, it would take quite a bit of incredible luck for it to simply fall into my hands, don't you agree? Geralt nodded in agreement. The world rarely worked with such convenient coincidences. So, is the book interesting, at least? Geralt asked, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Oh, yes, Yennefer confirmed, a flicker of genuine fascination in her violet eyes. If a bit unbelievable at times. He talks about advanced healing and brutal, efficient murder almost in the same breath, with the same detached, academic tone. It's quite unsettling. He also goes on and on, in these long, rambling passages, about these intricate plans he has for a girl he knows, a girl who, he claims, hasn't even been born yet. I believe he purposely leaves some crucial details out, though. He never once mentions his own name, nor the name of this mysterious, unborn girl. He also never specifies exactly what these grand plans he has for her actually are. It all just sounds so ridiculously unbelievable, yet so intensely interesting as well. And he also talks, quite casually, about how he is supposedly from a completely different world, and how our magic, our entire understanding of it, differs so fundamentally from his own. It's almost so utterly ridiculous that you can't help but believe it, surprisingly. Fascinating, Geralt grunted, genuinely intrigued now. Do you believe him to still be alive? I do, Yennefer said with certainty. He still appears, every now and then, in the most unexpected places. Many times, he appears in hospitals or plague-stricken villages and just starts healing people, often performing feats that even the most powerful mages on the continent would deem impossible. No sorcerer or sorceress has ever managed to catch him, though, never gotten to properly talk to him. He seems to have a kind of sixth sense for avoiding us, for disappearing the moment any of us get too close. I'd kill, she said, her voice turning almost bitter, to have just a few moments to talk with him. Geralt looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before it dawned on him. Of course. This Black Mage sounded like an expert magical healer, a master of life and restoration. And perhaps, Yennefer thought, he might be able to help her with her own problem, with her infertility, with her deepest, most painful desire to have a child. Perhaps you could try tracking him down, Geralt suggested, his voice softer now. I doubt I would be successful, Yennefer said with a sigh of resignation. He is, by all accounts, remarkably, almost supernaturally, good at hiding and covering his tracks. Well, you have to start somewhere, Gerald insisted. What do you know about him? Anything in that journal of his give you a hint, anything at all, that we could use to track him down? We? Yennefer asked, a small, knowing smirk finally appearing on her lips. Are you trying to tell me you want to come with me, Witcher? Gerald just shrugged, a gesture of casual acceptance. I don't have any other plans at the moment, he admitted, which was his way of saying yes. Well, Yennefer said, a thoughtful look on her face. There is one thing. In a recent entry that I have just read, he mentions a particular, rather, unique ability he has. He seems to have found a way to magically turn into another creature. A full transformation. Gerald immediately thought of a certain green-eyed, infuriatingly cheerful mage he knew, who just so happened to turn into a massive dragon in his off time. Still, he knew that transformation magic, becoming an animagus, was an ability that other powerful sorcerers could, with enough skill and practice, accomplish. So perhaps it was just a coincidence. What animal? Gerald asked, his voice carefully neutral. Well, that's the thing. Yennefer said, her violet eyes gleaming with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. He claims that he can turn into a dragon. Gerald's stomach dropped. Oh, hell! 1262, Sintra. Harry's POV. Harry watched silently, from his hidden vantage point in the deep, verdant shadows, as Gerald of Rivia and a young, ashen-haired girl, as well as another, older man that he did not recognize, walked into the hidden Dryad village deep within the heart of Brokilon Forest. Harry knew exactly what was about to happen here. Ethne, the wise and stubborn queen of the Dryads, would no doubt see the immense, raw potential in the young girl, Ciri, and she would try to turn her, to make her into one of her own people. And nothing Gerald could or would say, no amount of pleading or reasoning, would be able to change her mind once it was set. Harry, on the other hand, was very different. He knew there were things he could, and absolutely would, say that would most certainly change Ethne's mind. By this point, Gerald and Ciri had been taken before Ethne herself. Gerald made a polite, if somewhat stiff, gesture of respect to the ancient Dryad queen, while Ciri stood behind him, looking as if she desperately wanted to be anywhere else but there. Ethne started to speak to them, her voice calm and serene as always, as another one of her Dryad attendants stood silently by her side. Harry smiled briefly to himself at the fact that Ethne could no longer pull off such a convincingly serene look when he was around. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 39, Chapter 39, Brokilon. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry smiled briefly to himself at the fact that Ethne could no longer pull off such a convincingly serene look when he was around. Ethne, he knew, found his very presence to be deeply, profoundly annoying, yet he also knew, with a quiet certainty, that he had, over the many years, grown on her a little, like a particularly stubborn and irritating moss. He had, after all, placed powerful, complex enchantments all over the vast expanse of Brokilon Forest some years ago, at her unspoken request, to ensure that no outsiders could ever navigate its twisting paths unless they were a Dryad, or were personally guided by one. Ethne knew of this, and he knew she was thankful for his help, though she had, of course, never actually said it out loud. They had a strange, unique, and often confusing relationship, one that he was sure baffled Ethne at the best of times. Harry brought his attention back to the scene unfolding before him. Ethne said something else, her voice gentle but firm, about letting the group rest and stay for the night, and so they did. Harry, however, did not sleep that night. He simply watched over the camp, watched over Gerald and Ciri, a silent, unseen guardian. He didn't feel tired at all. When morning came, Harry was still up, still hidden, and still watching as Gerald and Ciri once again engaged in a heated, though one-sided, argument with Ethne over Ciri's fate. Harry continued to stare at the tense group, and watched as Gerald seemed to be arguing harder now, his voice growing more insistent, while at the same time, still trying desperately to remain polite and respectful. Ethne, however, finally silenced him with a single, stern look. She said something in return, her voice leaving no room for further debate, before she pulled out a simple wooden cup, filled to the brim with a strange, milky white liquid, the water of Brokilon. That was when Harry decided to interfere. He quickly, silently and expertly cast a powerful, multi-layered spell first, a full-body paralyzing charm, followed immediately by a stasis charm on both Gerald and Ciri. They froze instantly, mid-motion, their expressions locked in place, completely unaware that time, for them, had just come to a screeching halt. Ethne looked confused for a moment, her brow furrowing as her two guests suddenly became living statues. Then, a deep, thunderous scowl crossed her beautiful, ancient face. "Harry," she demanded, her voice low and dangerous, "come out, now." Harry obliged her demand, stepping out of a nearby, deep shadow, his expression sober and serious. "Hello, Ethne," Harry said politely, offering her a small, disarming smile, hoping to warm her up a little, though he knew, deep down, that the attempt was probably futile. "You're looking as beautiful and as regal as ever, my lady." "What have you done, D'Oin?" she demanded, her voice rising, losing its usual calm. "I demand that you release them immediately." Harry just shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Ethne," he said, his voice calm but firm. "At least, I can't yet, anyway. You and we need to talk." Ethne glared at him, a fierce, protective fire burning in her silver eyes. She made no move to attack him, though for a brief, tense second, she looked as if she was itching to go for the large, powerful bough that was leaning against a nearby wall. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight, as she visibly, forcefully, restrained her anger. Harry, with a casual flick of his wrist, conjured a simple, comfortable-looking wooden chair out of thin air. He sat down in it, crossing one leg casually over the other, his demeanor calm and composed, as if he were just settling in for a pleasant afternoon chat. "I know," Harry began, his voice calm but carrying the undeniable weight of absolute certainty, "that you want this girl right here," he gestured towards the frozen form of Ciri, "to join your little merry band of villagers for all eternity. I know that you see the great, raw potential, as well as the immense power, that resides within her. I also know," he added, his green eyes locking with Ethne's silver ones, "that you know her true identity, who she really is. So, you will understand when I say, unequivocally, that you may not have her. That she is not for you to take, not for you to steal away from her destiny." Ethne did not look pleased at all. In fact, a cold, dangerous fury began to smolder in her ancient eyes. "You have no right, D'Oin, to dictate who joins and who leaves my village, my home," she said, her voice turning as icy as a mountain peak in winter. "I am the leader here, the Queen of Brokilon, and as the leader, I decide who joins and who does not." Harry nodded slowly, as if he had expected that exact response. "I thought you would say something like that," he said, his expression still serious. "And I once told you, a long time ago, that one day I would give you a choice, Ethne. I am a man of my word, so here it is. Your choice." He leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Either you let this girl and her witcher companion go, freely and unharmed, or I will burn this entire village, and everyone in it, to the ground. Then, I will burn all of Brokilon, this entire ancient forest, down to the last twig, not because I necessarily want to see it gone, but because I will use its ashes as a stark, unforgettable message to all those in the future who might ever be foolish enough to try and stand against me. Or," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "you could simply let them go, in which case I will leave you and your people alone and, should you wish it, as a bonus, I will never, ever return to Brokilon again. The choice, Lady Ethne, is entirely yours." As he spoke, Harry let a small fraction of his immense, tightly controlled power radiate outwards from every pore of his body. It wasn't a hostile or aggressive display, just a simple, undeniable statement of fact. He could see that it had a noticeable, physical effect on Ethne. The air in the hut grew heavy, charged with ozone, and the ancient Dryad Queen, for the first time since he'd known her, looked genuinely shaken. "So," Ethne said, her voice a little strained, though she tried to hide it. "That's what this has all been about, all these years? Your visits, your interference? You wish to control the prophecy?" It sounded more like a statement than a question, a dawning, horrified realization. "If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 40, Dark. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. "So," Ethne said, her voice a little strained, though she tried to hide it. "That's what this has all been about, all these years? Your visits, your interference? You wish to control the prophecy?" It sounded more like a statement than a question, a dawning, horrified realization. Harry shook his head once again. "I could give two shits about the prophecy, Ethne, and what it says, what it foretells," he stated flatly, his voice cold. "I care nothing for it at all. The girl is all that matters to me. Her, and her happiness. There will be many, many people in her life who will seek to control her, to use her, to take her happiness away from her. And I," he said, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire, "will be the one to make absolutely sure that all who oppose her, all who try to harm her, will eventually become nothing more than maggot food. None shall stop me, Ethne. No one will stand in the way of this one, single goal of mine." Ethne stayed silently for a long moment, her silver eyes dark with thought, as she processed what he had told her, what he had threatened. She looked very, very displeased at the impossible options she was being given, but Harry already knew what choice she would make. He knew she loved her people, her family, far too much to ever put them at such an undeniable, catastrophic risk by standing against him. "Fine," Ethne finally spat out, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Take them, and be gone. And never, ever return to Brokilon." Harry surprised her by shaking his head. "That's not how this works, Ethne," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "See, I can't let them know about me interfering just yet. It's not the right time. So, here is what you're going to do. Instead of giving them your little brainwashing juice, your water of Brokilon, you will give them this." Harry held out his hand, and a simple wooden cup, identical to the one Ethne had been holding just moments ago, appeared out of thin air, filled with a liquid that looked exactly the same. "You will give them both this," Harry instructed. "It will cause them nothing more than some vivid, confusing hallucinations, but it will ultimately leave them with their minds, their memories, and their free will intact. And it will leave you with the convenient excuse that fate, or the water, or whatever you want to call it, simply interfered, that the girl was not meant to stay. You will do it exactly as I have instructed, Ethne, or our deal will be off, and I will kill you all." He hated playing the bad guy, the threatening, tyrannical sorcerer, but he also wouldn't feel too bad about it in this particular case. Ethne and her little forest band, for all their talk of nature and balance, had killed many, many people over the centuries, and lots of them were innocent of nothing more than accidentally stepping into their forest, some not even on purpose. Ethne was not someone he would ever describe as a good or nice person, but rather someone who fell firmly into the deep, complicated shades of grey that permeated this world. That wasn't even mentioning the fact that she routinely destroyed the minds and memories of the young women she recruited into her fold, just so she could mold them into something more to her liking, into her perfect, eternal daughters. Had this been Britain, had she committed such acts there, Ethne would have been given a one-way ticket through a different kind of archway, a death sentence, for all that she had done. As much as he had grown to, in his own strange way, like her, Harry knew she was getting off lightly. Ethne took the cup from him, her hand trembling slightly, and stared at the contents for a moment before looking up at him, her face a mask of grim resignation. "After this, you will leave?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. Harry nodded once, but said nothing more. "Fine," she said, her voice filled with a cold fury. "I will give them this, and then I will send them on their way, with no mention of you or your involvement. Now, be gone from my village. And I shall pray to the ancient spirits of this forest that I never have to see your face again." She stood there, regal and defiant, waiting for him to leave. "Goodbye, Ethne," Harry said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I hope, for your sake, that our paths never have to cross again in this way." And with that, he once more stepped back into the deepest shadows of the room and disappeared completely from her view. He then, from his unseen position, released the powerful paralysis and stasis charms he had placed on both Gerald and Ciri. He did not actually leave, of course. Not yet. He would remain, a silent, invisible observer, to make absolutely sure that Ethne honored their agreement. And he would, without hesitation, make good on his threat otherwise. Luckily, there seemed to be no need for any further violence. Ethne, true to her word, did honor their agreement, though she certainly didn't look happy about it. He had a feeling that Gerald, with his sharp witcher senses, had picked up on her strange, tense mood, but had wisely decided to say nothing for his own safety and for Ciri's. Eventually, Ethne gave Ciri the cup Harry had provided, and Harry watched as it had little to no discernible effect on her. This was on purpose, of course. The concoction he'd created was magically potent, but designed to be dulled, almost neutralized, by a strong, innate magical source. And Ciri, even as a young girl, had spades of elder blood magic coursing through her veins. Gerald, however, was not so lucky. Without Ciri's innate magical resistance, the potion hit him hard, and he went through quite a violently unpleasant hallucinatory experience, collapsing to the ground in a twitching, groaning heap. Ciri rushed to his side, looking over him with wide, worried eyes, but she could do nothing to help him. Harry was not concerned. He had made sure there would be no lasting physical or mental effects for Gerald, just a very, very bad trip. He watched as the Dryads, on Ethne's command, took both the unconscious Gerald and the very concerned Ciri and deposited them unceremoniously in the forest, semi-near the border of Brokilon, where Gerald finally, groggily, awoke. Harry then lifted the complex, disorienting enchantments he'd placed over the forest years ago, just for them, allowing them a clear path out. He watched them walk out of the ancient forest and, once more, set off down a dusty, uncertain road, together. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 41, Chapter 41, Black Mage. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki 1262, Vengerberg. Yennefer's POV. Yennefer sat in her plush, opulent mansion, a delicate, crystal glass of exquisite Evaluus wine in her hand. She was, once again, reading the weathered, leather-bound journal of the man who she strongly believed to be the infamous Black Mage. It had been several years now since she had first acquired it, and she had already read it from cover to cover multiple times, yet there was something about it, something inexplicable, that would always bring her back to its cryptic, fascinating pages. Perhaps, she mused, it was a desperate, lingering hope that maybe, just maybe, one day she would finally find the one tiny, overlooked detail, the one hidden clue, that would finally help her track the elusive man down. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang of self-loathing, it was just the foolishness of a powerful, desperate woman who had no other viable options left to her. No matter what it was, she still found a strange, compelling purpose in continuing to read it every now and again. She remembered, with a familiar ache in her heart, when she and Gerald had tried to track the man down together, with very little success, before eventually, inevitably, splitting off after another one of their fiery, passionate arguments. Her heart still ached a little whenever she thought about him. "It's at least a good read, I hope," a calm, unfamiliar voice suddenly said from across the room, startling Yennefer so badly that she shot up from her seat, the expensive wine sloshing dangerously in her glass. A half-formed, deadly spell was already crackling at her fingertips by the time she looked up and saw the man who had spoken. He was sitting casually, almost lazily, in a chair that looked remarkably, almost magically, similar to the one she had just vacated. "How bold you must be," Yennefer said, her voice a low, dangerous purr as she glared at the unexpected intruder, to break into a sorceress's house, and then so foolishly, so brazenly, announce your presence. "What is it that gives you such reckless bravery, stranger? And I suggest you speak quickly, for you will find that I have very, very little patience for uninvited guests." The man, however, didn't seem put off in the slightest that he was being threatened by one of the most powerful and famously short-tempered sorceresses on the entire continent. He just looked at her, an amused, almost placid expression on his handsome face. "Oh, I just came to pick up a little bit of my property," the man said calmly, "a piece of property that you seem to have acquired, shall we say." This caused Yennefer to glare even harder at him, her violet eyes narrowing. "I have stolen nothing from you," she spat, her mind racing. "So, now it would be best for you to leave, before that very small amount of patience I told you about wears completely out." She wondered, with a growing sense of unease, how this man had managed to so silently, so effortlessly, get past the powerful, complex protections she had placed on her house. He must be a sorcerer himself, and most likely, a very powerful one. Could he be trying to kill her, perhaps? An assassination attempt? But from who? What king, what rival mage, had finally ordered her head? "I didn't say you stole it," the man corrected her gently, "only that you had acquired it. And you do, most definitely, have it. In fact," he added, a small smile playing on his lips, "unless my eyes are starting to go in my old age, you were just reading it right now." As he spoke, he gestured with his hand, and the journal, which had fallen to the floor when she'd jumped up, flew into his waiting hands. He opened it, with a familiar ease, to the exact page Yennefer was sure she had just been reading. He mused, his green eyes scanning the page. "I see you were reading the part where I was messing around with the Witcher mutagens. I did have some modest success with that, you know. I managed to raise the survival odds for the trial of the grasses from a measly 1 in 10, to a much more respectable 6 or 7 out of every 10 children who underwent the process. Not a complete, resounding success, mind you, but I had become busy with other, more pressing things at the time, as I am sure you already know from reading my notes. The man gently closed the book and looked up at her, his expression serene. It didn't take another second for Yennefer to understand, with a sudden, shocking clarity, just who, exactly, she was talking to. You're the Black Mage, she asked, her voice a hushed whisper, though she already, with a certainty that made her heart pound, knew the answer. The man just nodded once. My friends call me Harry, he told her, his voice still calm, and I'd ask that you call me that as well. I'd also appreciate it if you didn't let that particular name get around too much. It causes complications. Yennefer knew his real name already, of course. Gerald had told her about his strange encounter with the man named Harry, the one who could turn into a dragon, years ago. But it was nice to have the confirmation directly from the source himself. Have you come just for your book then? Yennefer asked, her mind racing, wondering if he had possibly found out that she had been actively looking for him, trying to track him down. That's the main reason, he confirmed. Though I do find it incredibly curious that it ended up in your hands, of all the people in this entire world. Could you perhaps tell me how, exactly, you acquired my book? Harry asked, though Yennefer got the distinct, almost certain feeling that he was only asking out of a sense of polite formality, that he probably already knew the answer. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 42, Chapter 42, Price. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. That's the main reason, he confirmed. Though I do find it incredibly curious that it ended up in your hands, of all the people in this entire world. Could you perhaps tell me how, exactly, you acquired my book? Harry asked, though Yennefer got the distinct, almost certain feeling that he was only asking out of a sense of polite formality, that he probably already knew the answer. A traveling merchant, Yennefer explained, trying to keep her voice steady. He claimed to have found the book in a cave he'd spent the night in, and he sold it to me for a few orens. I don't think he knew what it truly was, or that it was yours. Harry nodded at her explanation, a thoughtful look on his face. Funny how that works out, isn't it? He said, almost to himself. I suppose it was fate, more than anything else. That meddling bitch. Well, he said, suddenly businesslike again, now that I have the book, I really should be off. Thank you for its safe return. Harry stood from the conjured chair, which then vanished in a puff of smoke. Yennefer's eyes widened in panic. She quickly put her hands out, as if to physically stop him. Wait, she exclaimed, her voice more desperate than she intended. I wish to ask you some questions, if you would. After all, she added, thinking quickly, I did technically pay for the book that you're now taking back. At the very least, you could allow me to ask you some things, as repayment for the money that I spent on it. A ghost of a smile, a flicker of genuine amusement, appeared on Harry's face as he stared at her. So, let me get this straight, he asked, his tone light and teasing. You seek to be reimbursed, with my time and knowledge, for recovering my lost property, which you feel you now have some claim to, because you paid a random merchant a pittance for it, a merchant who, by his own admission, simply found it in a cave where I had left it. Is that correct? Yennefer looked him directly in the eyes, and letting her own considerable charm and allure flow, she smiled, a slow, sensual, alluring smile. Yes, of course, she purred, her voice a low, seductive whisper. You wouldn't mind spending just a little more time with me, would you? She asked, trying to subtly charm the man into staying, a tactic that had worked on countless kings, nobles, and mages before. The man, Harry, just threw his head back and laughed, a loud, clear, genuinely amused laugh that both angered and intensely annoyed Yennefer. "You're about a century too early, and perhaps a dimension too late, to be trying to charm me into doing something, Lady Yennefer," he said, his laughter subsiding, though his eyes still sparkled with amusement. "But, nevertheless, I suppose I can spare a few more moments of my time. Speak quickly, and I will either answer you honestly, or I will not answer you at all." Yennefer breathed a small, internal sigh of relief. At least she had gotten him to stay, despite the fact that he had just practically, and rather rudely, insulted her considerable charms. "Excellent," she said, her voice regaining its usual composure. "As you can imagine, I found many, surprising things in your journal." "Is all of it true?" she asked, figuring she would start off with a light, general question, before working her way into what she really wanted to know. "It is," Harry responded simply, his voice a calm, even tone. Yennefer had hoped he would elaborate, perhaps offer some intriguing detail or anecdote, but he simply stared at her pleasantly, his green eyes watchful, and waited for her to ask something else. She had to physically stop herself from gritting her teeth in sheer annoyance at the man's infuriatingly placid demeanor. "What was the world you left like?" she asked, trying to keep her voice civil, to play along with his little game for now. "Advanced," Harry said without hesitation, "beautiful, and, ultimately, incredibly boring." He then leaned forward slightly, his pleasant expression shifting into one of mild impatience. "I understand you're trying to butter me up, Lady Yennefer, to lead me gently to whatever it is you truly want to ask me. But I really do have to go soon, so could you perhaps just ask me what you desire, so I may be on my way?" Yennefer scowled, her carefully constructed mask of polite curiosity slipping for a moment, but she soon wiped the look from her face, replacing it with a cool, business-like expression. "So be it," she said, her voice crisp. "In your journal, you mention, several times, your ability to heal almost anything. And if you can't heal it directly, you can usually find ways to, as you put it, solve the problem. Is this true?" "It is," Harry said again, his gaze unwavering as he continued to look at her. Yennefer just realized, with a slightly unnerving jolt, that the man hadn't blinked once, not a single time, as he stared her directly in the eye throughout this entire, strange conversation. It was almost unnerving, especially coming from someone who looked so deceptively young. "Good," Yennefer said, taking a steadying breath. "As you may already know, sorceresses, as a result of our magical abilities, are rendered infertile. We cannot conceive children." "Most are, yes, but not all," Harry interrupted her gently. "There are always rare exceptions to every rule, biological or magical. But please, continue with your point." Yennefer wished, with a sudden, fierce intensity, that she could scold him for interrupting her, for his know-it-all attitude. But she was currently in desperate need of his help, so therefore, she would have to play nice, at least for the time being. "Yes, well," she continued, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I wish for you to heal my reproductive system, if it is at all possible. I wish for you to make me fertile again." She finally said it, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. There was a moment of complete silence as the man, Harry, just looked at her, and for the first time, Yennefer could tell that he was genuinely surprised. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 43, Chapter 43, Bonds. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. "Yes, well," she continued, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I wish for you to heal my reproductive system, if it is at all possible. I wish for you to make me fertile again. She finally said it, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. There was a moment of complete silence as the man, Harry, just looked at her, and for the first time, Yennefer could tell that he was genuinely surprised. You wish to have a child, he said, his voice softer now, his expression one of genuine curiosity. Why? Yennefer's heart skipped a beat. Why? She repeated, her voice rising in an almost frustrated tone. Do I truly need a reason to want to try my hand at being a mother? Most women, it is simply expected of them. Why should I, of all people, be denied that chance, that simple, fundamental experience? Harry once more just looked at her, his green eyes seeming to see right through her, to the deep, aching void she had carried within her for so long. He sat silently for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable as he seemed to be contemplating something deep within his own head. I am afraid I can, unfortunately, not give you what you ask for, Harry said finally, his voice filled with a quiet, sincere regret. I am truly sorry. Yennefer felt her body fill with a white-hot, blinding rage at his words, a wave of bitter disappointment so intense it almost made her physically sick. But she quickly, ruthlessly, calmed herself, pushing the rage down, locking it away. May I ask why you will not help me? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. If it's a matter of money, of payment. She tried, her mind already calculating what she could possibly offer him. It is not about money, Harry said, shaking his head. It is simply about me, not being able to meddle in certain specific matters. Matters that might affect certain things down the line. My hands are tied on this particular issue, my lady. I am truly, deeply sorry. He sounded so genuinely sad, so regretful, that it almost made her anger falter. Yennefer looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, and did her absolute best not to let the hot tears that were burning the backs of her eyes escape. Not now. Not in front of him. All these years, all this desperate hope, thinking that he, this mythical, all-powerful black mage, would finally be the answer to her deepest prayer, only to find yet another dead end, another slammed door. Perhaps she really was just stuck in this cruel lot in life. Maybe, she thought with a fresh wave of bitterness, she just deserved it. I cannot heal your organs, Yennefer, Harry said softly, his voice gentle, pulling her from her dark thoughts. But I do see a child in your future. Yennefer's head shot up, her violet eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. What do you mean? She asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Are you saying there is something, someone else, that can heal me? No, Harry said, shaking his head again. But I do see a child. A girl. You will love her very, very much, and she, in turn, will love you. An unexpected child, at that. She will be quite the surprise, I am sure. Remember to keep your eyes, and your heart, open for possibilities, Lady Yennefer. They present themselves to us every day, often in the most peculiar, unexpected ways. He stood up then, and looked as if he was about to leave the room. Wait, hold on! Yennefer exclaimed, scrambling to her feet. What does that mean? A child? How? Harry smiled, that same infuriatingly enigmatic, yet somehow comforting, smile. I must leave now, but perhaps I should leave you with some parting words to ponder. Always remember, Yennefer, that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. What does that mean? Yennefer asked, completely bewildered. It means, Harry said, his green eyes seeming to pierce right through to her soul, that the family that you choose, the bonds you forge through love and loyalty, will always be more important, more real, than the one your blood simply chooses for you. Goodbye, Lady Yennefer. And enjoy the rest of your Beltane. And with that, he was simply gone. Yennefer just stood there, staring at the now empty room, her mind reeling with a mixture of surprise, frustration, and a tiny, treacherous spark of renewed hope. The man had not used a portal to make his exit, she realized with a jolt. He had simply warped, and then disappeared into thin air. She had never seen anything like it before in her long life. It was impossible. Yennefer sighed to herself after spending a few more long moments in the silent, empty room. She finally went to her bedroom and prepared for bed, her mind still a whirlwind of confusing thoughts and emotions. That night, she dreamt of Geralt. A wonderful, vivid dream, full of passion and longing. It was Beltane, after all. 1262, Cintra. Harry's POV. Harry stood silently, a shadow among shadows, on top of one of the highest towers in the sprawling city of Cintra, and watched the northern horizon. He could see the approaching Nilfgaardian army from here, a vast, dark, inexorable tide of black and gold, and there seemed to be thousands upon thousands of them, marching relentlessly towards the doomed city. He watched as the terrified townspeople below scrambled for cover, their panicked screams a faint, distant chorus on the wind. He watched as they tried to flee the city, clogging the southern gates, while the city guard, and what little remained of the once proud Cintran army, prepared to defend their home to their very last, dying breath. They were probably only 1,000 men strong, at most, if Harry's quick, experienced estimate was correct. Even if he didn't already know, from Ciri's stories, exactly what was about to happen here, he could have easily guessed the outcome. Cintra would be crushed. It was no longer a matter of if, but simply when. Ciri had not told him exactly how long Cintra had managed to last against the Nilfgaardian onslaught, but if Harry had to guess, based on the sheer size and discipline of the approaching army, he would say that this would all be over in less than 24 hours. Nilfgaard was coming from three sides: the north, the west, and the east, leaving only the southern road for people to escape. Sadly, there was a wide, slow-moving river, the Yeroga, that significantly slowed down the escape of the desperate townspeople, creating a bottleneck of chaos and fear. Harry wasn't concerned about that, though. Not really. He was only concerned with the fate of the royal family. It seemed that the formidable Queen Callanth was not going to let her city, her kingdom, go down without a bloody, desperate fight. And, true to her fierce, warrior nature, she seemed to want to lead that fight herself, from the very front lines. Harry watched, a silent, unseen observer, as the two opposing forces finally met, just outside the city walls, with a great, deafening roar of steel, fury, and dying men. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 44, Chapter 44, Tired. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry was only really concerned about the fate of the royal family. It seemed that Queen Callanth, true to her fiery lioness of Cintra reputation, was not going to let her city go down without a bloody, desperate fight, and she, of course, seemed determined to lead that fight herself, right from the front lines. Harry watched with a detached, almost clinical eye as the two opposing forces finally met just outside the city walls, their meeting marked by a great, deafening roar of steel, fury, and dying men. Harry sighed, a long, weary sound that was lost in the wind. To be completely, brutally honest, he was quite tired of wars. He had partaken in a few minor ones, here and there, while he had been in this world, for causes he had, at the time, felt were just. Nothing major, not on the scale of his own war back home, but he had been involved enough that he was now just, honestly tired of seeing people die, of watching lives get snuffed out, all to satisfy some petty ruler's insatiable greed for more power and more land. Nilfgaard, he knew, was no different from any of the other power-hungry empires he had encountered in his long life. And he had a strong, gut feeling that sooner or later, he and they would inevitably come to blows. He didn't like their arrogant, conquer-the-world attitude, nor did he particularly like this Emir race, their mysterious, ambitious emperor. From what little he had gathered, the man reminded Harry, quite unpleasantly, of Lucius Malfoy. He was glad, at least, that Draco Malfoy had eventually, after much struggle, given up the whole blood purity nonsense and had just stayed out of politics entirely, content to live a quiet life. Lucius, however, had to die. And he had, quite satisfyingly, done so by Harry's own hand. Emir would probably, eventually, end up the same way. Plus, there was the whole, rather disturbing situation of Emir being utterly, pathologically obsessed with Ciri. And Harry simply couldn't, and wouldn't, have that. As he continued to stare down at the chaotic, bloody battle unfolding below, a sleek, black crow flew down from the sky and landed silently on his shoulder. Harry didn't even bother to look at the bird as it leaned in, put its sharp beak right at his ear, and, surprisingly, whispered into it, its voice a low, raspy murmur. "He has scouts in the city, searching for her now. The army is a distraction. They are heading to the northeast. We are tracking them," the crow murmured, its voice a strange, multi-layered sound. It then hopped off his shoulder and took to the skies once more, flying off in the exact direction it had just told him. Harry looked into that direction, to the northeast, and did indeed see a large, swirling swarm of crows circling high above a specific section of the city, further in. He took one last, lingering look back at the brutal battle raging at the city gates, then, with a soft pop, he apparated away, reappearing silently on a high, slanted rooftop, right in the middle of the swarm of what, to anyone below, would just look like inconspicuous, ordinary crows. No one seemed to be paying any attention to the birds. And they were also, thankfully, not paying any attention to him as he looked down into a narrow, winding alleyway below. He saw three men, dressed in rough, local-looking clothes, moving in a panicked, yet purposeful rush, trying very hard not to draw suspicion, yet they were clearly, and rather foolishly, moving towards the royal castle, not away from it like every other sane person in the city. His eyes never left the three men as they ducked down another, even narrower alleyway, probably not knowing, in their haste, that it was a dead end. Harry apparated once more, this time appearing silently at the alley's entrance, and with a few quick, silent waves of his wand, he covered the entrance in subtle, but highly effective, notice-me-not and compulsion charms, designed to steer everyone clear of it, to make them simply, not notice the alley was even there. "Hold up, Kalisk, this is a bloody dead end, you twit," one of the men said, his voice a harsh whisper, laced with a thick, unfamiliar accent. "If you can't read the goddamn map, then let me read it." "Hold on a moment, I know where we are," the man now identified as Kalisk insisted, pointing a grimy finger at a crumpled piece of parchment he had clutched in his hands. "We're here, see? We took a wrong turn, that's all. But we're close, I tell you." Harry said nothing, simply leaning against the cold stone wall, waiting patiently for the men to inevitably turn around and notice him. He didn't have to wait long. "Wait a moment," the third man, the one who had not said anything yet, said, his voice suddenly tense as he finally looked back towards the alley entrance and saw Harry, simply standing there, a silent, shadowy figure. "Who's this?" The man named Kalisk whirled around, his eyes wide with surprise. With all three of them now turned towards him, Harry could understand why their king would have chosen them for this particular mission. They clearly weren't the sharpest daggers in the armory, but all three of them could, at a passing glance, easily pass for locals of Sintra, with their rough-spun clothes and their generally unremarkable features. "Evening, gentlemen," Harry said, his voice almost pleasant, his tone light and conversational. "You wouldn't happen to be out and about, on this lovely, chaotic day, for a spot of kidnapping, would you? The three men had an immediate, almost comical twitch at his words, a flicker of guilt and panic in their eyes that instantly confirmed his thoughts. Kidnapping? No, sir. Of course not, Kalisk responded, trying, and failing, to sound casual. We are just a little lost, you see. Trying to get out of town before Nilfgaard shows up, just like everyone else. Oh? Harry asked, his curiosity feigned. And how long have you gentlemen lived in this fair city? Oh, ever since we were little lads. Kalisk said quickly, a little too quickly, as his two friends nodded nervously in agreement. Is that so? Yet you do not seem to know your way around your own home city, nor do you seem to be carrying anything with you to take on your supposed journey, Harry observed, his voice still calm. How strange. I'm afraid I don't believe you, gentlemen. Which is quite unfortunate for you, since I am sure you can probably guess what happens next. Well, he corrected himself with a small, chilling smile, you can probably guess the end result, at least. I highly doubt you would have guessed how, exactly, we're going to get to that end result. But no matter. Try not to scream. All right, that's enough of this bloody nonsense, the man to Kalisk's right snarled, his fear quickly turning to aggression. Let's just gut the bastard and be done with this. He pulled out a long, wicked-looking dagger. His two companions followed suit, their own blades glinting in the dim alley light. Harry said nothing. He simply, casually, waved his hand. With a silent, powerful summoning charm, the daggers were ripped from their owners' hands, flying through the air to hover, menacingly, directly in front of him. The men started to curse, their eyes wide with terror now. Shite! He's a source, Kalisk tried to say, but Harry did not let him finish. He rotated the three daggers in the air with another flick of his wrist, so they were pointing back at their original owners, and then, with a powerful banishing charm, he sent them flying back with as much deadly precision as he could muster. He was rewarded, a split second later, with three, almost simultaneous, wet schlick noises, as the daggers found their marks, embedding themselves deep in the men's throats. Harry smiled, a cold, satisfied smile, as he gave himself a mental pat on the back. His precision work with telekinesis had definitely been improving lately. Harry looked at the three dead bodies, now slumping to the ground in a growing pool of their own blood, and decided to simply leave them there. The conquering Nilfgaardians would eventually find them when they finally took the city, or they wouldn't. Either way, Harry couldn't have cared less. With another soft pop, he operated away from the gruesome murder scene. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 45, Chapter 45, Yeroga. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. The next day. Listen to me, child, Queen Callanth said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency as she knelt down on one knee in front of her terrified, sobbing granddaughter. Sir Laszlo will take you to the river. You must cross it, and get to the other side. You must find the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia. He will take care of you. Do you understand me, Ciri? Harry, once again a silent, unseen observer in the chaos of the falling castle, hated these kinds of scenes. Watching families get torn apart, watching these final, heartbreaking goodbyes, was always the worst part of any war. And it was especially hard when you knew the family, which Harry, by this point, most definitely did. I don't want to, Grandmama. I want to stay with you. Ciri cried, clinging tightly to her grandmother, her small face streaked with tears and soot. Callanth wrapped her arms around Ciri, holding her fiercely, for what she knew, and Harry knew, was going to be the very last time. "I'll always be with you, Ciri," Callanth whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Inside you. In your heart. I love you more than anything in this world, always remember that." "Laszlo," she commanded, her voice suddenly regaining its regal authority, "take her from here. Don't stop for anything until you've crossed the Yeroga. Protect her with your very life." A young knight, waiting in full armor a few feet from them, his face grim and determined, nodded his head sharply. He walked over and, with a heavy heart, picked up the struggling, crying Ciri and literally began to drag her away from her grandmother. "It has been an honor, my queen," the young knight, Sir Laszlo, said, his voice filled with emotion as he bowed his head one last time. "I will protect her to my dying breath." Then, he turned and ran out of the throne room, with Ciri still screaming in protest, her small voice echoing through the chaos. "No, Grandmama! Please, don't make me go! Grandmama!" Ciri shrieked as the man took her out one of the hidden side doors of the castle. Callanth watched them leave, hot tears finally pooling in her fierce eyes and streaming down her face. "A rarity, as any who knew her well could tell you." "My lady? What shall we do now?" another knight, his face covered in soot and blood, asked from behind her. Callanth wiped her tears away with a furious, defiant gesture, her grief momentarily replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She turned around, her expression one of grim determination. The throne room was now flooding with what remained of her loyal knights and nobles. "Barricade all the doors," Callanth answered, her voice ringing with authority. "Sintra shall never bow to Nilfgaard. If they want this throne, then they will have to take it from our cold, dead hands." The knight's face hardened, but he nodded, a new fire lit in his eyes. Harry had seen enough. He sat, crouched silently in the high, shadowy rafters of the great hall, a silent witness to the end of an era. With a quiet, almost imperceptible pop, he apparated away, reappearing in a dark, secluded alleyway where a sturdy, black horse was tied and hidden, waiting for him. He hopped onto the horse's back and waited, his senses on high alert, amidst the now burning, screaming city. He tried his best to ignore the terrible sounds of pain and terror that he could now clearly hear all around him, the screams of the innocent and the dying. After a few tense minutes, he saw it. A black horse, galloping at full speed, with a man in full armor holding a small, struggling person in front of him. It was the flash of ashen white hair, even in the smoky, dim light, that gave away the final hint of who was on that horse. They sped by his hiding spot, but Harry continued to wait, as they were not who he was waiting for. He didn't have to wait long, either. It was maybe 20 more seconds before a storm of horses thundered past, all of them ridden by men in full, menacing black armor, and all of them going in the exact same direction as Ciri and her protector. When the last horse of the pursuing party went by, Harry kicked his own horse into action, spurring it forward and chasing after the black-armored men. Operating wouldn't be able to keep up with a constant, moving chase like this, and he couldn't simply wait ahead of them because he was unsure of the exact path they would take. More importantly, he didn't want to risk letting Ciri see him. So, he rode, and he rode hard, his powerful horse eating up the ground, closing the distance. It didn't take them long to exit the burning city and start approaching the wide, muddy banks of the Yeroga River. Sadly, it seemed that Sir Laszlo's luck had just run out. It looked as if one of the pursuing Nilfgaardians had a crossbow with them and had managed to get off a lucky shot, striking the poor knight's horse in the head, causing it to go down with a sickening cry, dead before it hit the ground. Laszlo, with his last, heroic act, wrapped his own armored body around Ciri as they fell, shielding her from the worst of the impact. Harry slowed his horse to a stop, pulling into the cover of a small, dense forest, and thanked whoever might be listening that he at least had some cover to stay hidden. He watched briefly as the scene unfolded. Laszlo stood up from the ground, clearly injured, his movements slow and pained. He gently, but firmly, shoved Ciri in the direction of the river. "Go, princess," he yelled, his voice ragged. "Run, and don't you dare look back. I will stall them for as long as I can." The Nilfgaardians were getting off their own horses now, pulling out their long, sharp swords. "Laszlo!" Ciri said, her voice filled with tears, her small body frozen with fear. "I said go. Run and don't look back." If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 46, Chapter 46, Swallow. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. I said go. Run and don't look back. Laszlo yelled, before letting out a fierce war cry and charging at the nearest Nilfgaardian soldier. Surprisingly, he was able to catch the man off guard, his desperate, final lunge piercing through a chink in the man's armor, right at the vulnerable spot at his neck. This time, Ciri decided to listen. She turned and ran, as her brave protector, Sir Laszlo, fought like a cornered, caged animal. As soon as Harry felt that Ciri had gotten far enough away, that she was out of sight, he moved in to help the man. He wasted no time. "Sectum Sempra," Harry whispered, the familiar, vicious incantation rolling off his tongue. The curse was, in essence, an invisible, slashing sword that would cut into a target multiple times. Harry, however, had modified it years ago for group use. Now, it sent more of a wide, invisible wave of slashes in a given direction, and when it found a target, it would only slash them once. So, it had less concentrated power than the original spell, but against unarmored, or even lightly armored, opponents, a single, deep sword slash hardly mattered. You were either going to be dead, or dying. And dead or dying the 5 men who it hit most certainly were, as they all screamed in agony and fell to the ground, clutching at deep, bleeding gashes, their armor having offered them little to no protection against the magical assault. This seemed to greatly alarm the last 4 remaining men, as well as their commander, a tall, intimidating man who was in heavy, ornate plate armor, with black, bird-like wings adorning his helmet. "Finish the man and go for the girl," the commander ordered his remaining soldiers, his voice a menacing, muffled boom from behind his helm. "I will deal with this, sorcerer." "Not likely," Harry retorted, a sneer twisting his lips as he recognized the man from Ciri's nightmares, from her stories. "Kahir mar dyffrynaep seal latch. You see, I happen to know that you caused someone I care for very deeply to have terrible nightmares for years and years. That's a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, that I now need to pay you back for." "We shall see," the man said, as his boys went back to attacking the now grievously injured Sir Laszlo. Harry, with a flick of his wrist, summoned a long, sturdy branch from a nearby tree and, with another silent, instantaneous act of transfiguration, turned it into a sharp, gleaming longsword. Harry began to circle the man slowly. Yes, he could have, quite easily, murdered the man with a dozen different spells from a distance. But sometimes, you just needed to get up close and personal, in a visceral, brutal way that magic simply could not replicate. That, and Harry had a lot of built-up anger and frustration from the last 24 hours that he was just itching to vent. The man, Kahir, took a step forward and swung his massive broadsword in a powerful, horizontal slash. Ciri had once told him, during their training sessions, that he should never try to block a direct sword strike from a larger, stronger opponent. That he was built more for speed and agility than for brute strength. Remembering this, Harry swung his own transfigured sword diagonally across his body, not to block, but to deflect, hitting the man's sword upwards and giving Harry a precious, split-second opening to dodge under the powerful swing. Harry was no witcher, but he did consider himself pretty fast, and this man was wearing heavy, cumbersome plate armor. Despite this, the man recovered from his mist swing with surprising speed. Harry, however, decided to immediately go on the offensive. He feinted to the right, then, as the man moved to block, he suddenly lowered his blade, changing the attack from a downward slash to a swift, horizontal one, catching the man off guard. Sadly, the transfigured blade simply scraped loudly against the man's thick, high-quality plate armor, sending sparks flying but doing no real damage. "You fought honorably, sorcerer," the man said, his deep, muffled voice echoing from within his helmet. "You chose not to use magic, even when knowing it put you at a clear disadvantage. But even you must see that this is the end for you now." Harry nodded, taking a deep, steadying breath. "You're right," he admitted, his voice calm. "It seems I am out of practice with a blade this heavy. It's much too cumbersome for my style." He then stabbed the long sword into the soft, loamy ground and, with another flick of his wrist, picked up a much smaller, seemingly insignificant stick from the forest floor. A stick which, in the span of a single heartbeat, transformed into a beautiful, wickedly sharp, perfectly balanced dagger. "I need more speed," Harry said, testing the weight of the new blade. "That's the problem." "Speed is no matter," the man said, his voice filled with the arrogance of a seasoned warrior. "Skill is what truly matters." Harry nodded again, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "I think," he said, "that we can both agree on that." And then, he charged, a blur of motion, straight at the heavily armored man. Kahir quickly lifted his massive broadsword and swiped at him again, a powerful, cleaving blow. But Harry, anticipating the move, dropped low to his knees, sliding on the damp earth under the incoming blade and past the man's armored legs. In one fluid, continuous motion, Harry spun around and, with a vicious slash, sliced right through the unprotected back of the man's kneecaps, severing tendons and ligaments. The man yelled, a raw, agonized sound, dropped his heavy sword with a loud clang, and fell hard to his knees, his legs no longer able to support his weight. Harry stood up and walked casually back around the kneeling, incapacitated man. The man was now on his hands and knees, breathing heavily, trying to push himself up. "I still didn't use any offensive magic?" Harry asked, his voice conversational, almost rhetorical, as he pulled his transfigured longsword from the ground where he'd left it and walked closer to the man, who was now struggling, and failing, to get back to his feet. "Does that mean I was still being honorable? If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 47, Chapter 47, Lioness Falls. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. "I still didn't use any offensive magic?" Harry asked, his voice conversational, almost rhetorical, as he pulled his transfigured longsword from the ground where he'd left it and walked closer to the man, who was now struggling, and failing, to get back to his feet. "Does that mean I was still being honorable? It would seem." The man gasped, his voice tight with pain, as he managed to get off his hands and look up at Harry, his head tilted back. Harry could just barely see the man's dark brown eyes through the narrow slit of his helmet. "That I made the mistake of underestimating your skill. Call it what you want," Harry said, his voice turning cold. "You hurt someone I cared for. You haunted her dreams. A fatal mistake. Any last words?" he asked, as he rose the heavy long sword high above his head, its blade glinting in the dim, smoky light. The man looked him directly in the eyes, but still didn't bother to try and take off his helmet. "Long live the Emperor," the man said, his voice filled with a final, defiant loyalty. A poor choice of last words, Harry said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I can guarantee you, he won't live nearly as long as he would wish. And with that, he brought the sword down hard, killing the man almost instantly. He left the sword embedded in him and walked away, back towards where Sir Laszlo was lying on the ground, surrounded by the last 4 dead Nilfgaardian soldiers. He jogged over to the fallen knight, only to see him staring up at the sky with glassy, unseeing eyes. Harry sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Sorry, man," he said softly. "I hope you find the peace that so often eludes men in life, in death." He gently closed the young knight's eyes and sent a silent, heartfelt prayer for him to whatever god, or gods, may be listening in this strange, violent world. He then sat down on the ground by the fallen man and took a much-needed breather, the sounds of the distant, dying city still echoing around him. Callanth's POV. Callanth stood in the highest tower of her castle, the wind whipping at her hair and her royal robes, and looked out over her burning, dying kingdom. She could hear the terrified screams of her people from down below, a sound that would haunt her for eternity, as well as the loud, rhythmic banging coming from the barricaded throne room door behind her, as the Nilfgaardian soldiers tried to break through and capture her, to do God knows what with. But they would never take her. She, the Lioness of Sintra, would not be taken prisoner, to be kept as leverage, or worse. She looked down at the long, dizzying drop. "You sure you want to do that, Callanth?" a calm, familiar voice asked from behind her. She looked back swiftly, but did not turn her body, for fear of accidentally slipping on the treacherous, narrow ledge. She saw a man standing there, a man with hair as black as a starless night and eyes that shone like brilliant, polished emeralds. It had been more years than she could accurately say since she had last seen him, but she would never, ever forget that face. "Apollo?" she asked, using the name he had given her all those years ago when he had saved her from the poison. "Or do you perhaps prefer the Black Mage these days?" she asked, a single, weary eyebrow raised. "Harry, actually," he said, a small, sad smile on his lips. "And I once cured you of a deadly, fast-acting ailment, Callanth. It was, I must admit, one of my prouder, more satisfying moments. Are you absolutely set on this path?" Harry asked her, his voice serious, his green eyes filled with a strange, ancient sorrow. "That depends," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging around them. "Are you here to give me back my kingdom? To beat back the Nilfgaardian hordes and save my city?" Harry shook his head slowly. "I am not," he said softly. "But I could take you away from here. Right now. You could stay hidden, with no one in the world the wiser that you had survived. Just say the words, Callanth, and we will leave this place." Callanth looked back out over her burning kingdom, over the smoldering ruins of everything she had built, everything she had fought for, and she felt a single, hot tear slowly make its way down her cheek. "I was born the Queen of Sintra," Callanth finally said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable finality. "I wish to die as one as well." Harry said nothing in response for a long moment, just stood there, respecting her decision. "If that is truly your wish," he said at last, "then I will respect it." "Wait," she said, a sudden, panicked thought striking her. "I have a granddaughter, Ciri. She is making her way to the Yaru." "Do not worry," Harry interrupted her gently. "I have already made sure that she got across the river safely, before I came here. I cannot, however, say the same for Sir Laszlo. The man died making sure she had time to escape. He was a true knight." Callanth breathed a shaky sigh of immense relief upon hearing that her granddaughter, her precious Ciri, was safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It seems you have a rather persistent habit of helping my family." "More than you could possibly know," Harry told her, his voice quiet, almost wistful. She nodded, but didn't ask him to elaborate. She knew it would be pointless. I don't suppose you know anything about death, she asked, her voice almost rhetorical, as she once more walked to the very edge of the stone parapet, the wind whipping her hair wildly around her face. I'd like to think so, Harry told her, his voice calm and steady behind her. Considering I have, in fact, died once before. She raised an eyebrow at that, but did not turn around. And, she asked, her gaze fixed on the long drop below. It's quicker, and easier, than falling asleep, he replied. She smiled, a small, sad, but genuine smile. Good. And with that, she stepped off the edge. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki